This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've never talked about this publicly before. It happened when I was 16, during summer break in Cheney, Arizona. Even typing this makes my hands shake. I keep telling myself it was just some creep, but deep down, I know it wasn't human. At least not entirely. That night started off normal enough. Me, my sister Kara, 14, my two cousins Jenny and Leah, 15 and 13, and my friend Derek were hanging out at my grandparents' home. My grandparents lived in this isolated place about 40 minutes outside of Cheney proper. It was mostly Navajo families scattered around, with large gaps of nothing between houses. My grandpa had this big property with a pickup truck, a small hill behind the house, and a vegetable garden my grandma was super proud of. We were just being dumb teenagers, roasting marshmallows, telling stories, laughing. My parents and grandparents were inside, probably watching TV or something. It was one of those perfect summer nights where the stars look unreal because there's no light pollution. Around midnight, the girls decided they were going to sleep in the bed of the pickup truck. They had this whole setup with blankets and pillows. Said it would be fun to sleep under the stars. Derek and I were going to crash in this old van my grandpa kept parked near the front of the property. I remember checking on the girls before Derek and I headed to the van. Leah and Jenny were already half asleep, but Kara was wide awake, just staring at the sky. She always loved astronomy. I asked if she was good, and she nodded and said, "It's just so beautiful out here." I told her not to stay up too late, and she rolled her eyes at me like little sisters do. Derek and I hung out on the porch for a bit longer. We were talking about school starting in a few weeks and how much it was gonna suck. It must have been around 1 a.m. when we heard it, this spine-chilling scream that I knew immediately was Kara. I practically flew off that porch. Derek was right behind me. The girls were scrambling out of the truck bed, falling over each other. Kara was hyperventilating, her face ghost white. Jenny and Leah were crying. "What happened?" I grabbed Kara's shoulders. She was shaking so hard I thought she might break apart. "Kara, what happened?" She couldn't even form words at first, just kept looking back at the truck with these huge, terrified eyes. My parents and grandparents came running out of the house. Finally, Kara managed to tell us what she saw. She'd been looking at the stars, completely relaxed, when she noticed the neighbors' dogs going crazy, barking and howling like they were scared of something. Then she felt cold, like suddenly the temperature dropped 20 degrees. She said she felt watched, so she turned her head toward the cab of the truck. That's when she saw it. There was someone, something, crouched on top of the truck cab, looking down at her. She said its eyes reflected light like an animal's, but it had a human-like shape. The worst part? She said she couldn't move, like physically couldn't scream or move a muscle, just frozen there, staring back at it. It wasn't until Leah woke up suddenly. She said she felt something bad, like a nightmare, but she was awake, that Kara could move again. The second Leah sat up, Kara found her voice and screamed, and the thing just vanished. Not like ran away, like it disappeared. My dad thought it was probably just some homeless person or teenager playing a prank. My grandpa was more worried it was a burglar. My mom was trying to calm the girls down, but my grandma, she got this look on her face. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she knew something she wasn't sharing. After some discussion, my dad and Derek grabbed flashlights to check around the property. I wanted to go too, partly because I was worried about them, partly because I was so freaked out I didn't want to be separated from anyone. My grandpa grabbed his shotgun from inside. I'd never seen him take it out before, which told me how seriously he was taking this. We were about to head out when Kara suddenly grabbed my arm, her nails digging in. "There," she whispered. We all turned to where she was pointing, toward the hill behind the house. I'll never forget what I saw. In the darkness, illuminated only by the porch light in the distance, something was moving up the hill, fast, not running like a person, more like loping. It moved in this weird, unnatural way, like its joints bent wrong. We couldn't make out details, just a dark figure against the darker hill. Then it crested the top and was gone. My grandpa fired 2 shots into the air. He said it was to scare off whoever it was, but looking back, I don't think he expected it to work on a normal person. The shots echoed in the quiet night, and everything went still again. The neighbors' dogs had even stopped barking. We searched the property anyway. Derek, my dad, my grandpa, and me. We found nothing. No footprints, no evidence anyone had been there. When we got back, my mom had the girls inside with hot chocolate. My grandma was burning something in the fireplace, even though it was summer and way too hot for a fire. She was also mumbling something in Navajo that I couldn't understand. The adults decided we should all sleep inside, safety in numbers. My grandparents' house wasn't huge, so we made a sort of camp in the living room. The girls took the couches, and Derek and I set up sleeping bags on the floor. My parents took the guest room, and my grandparents were in their bedroom down the hall. I didn't think any of us would sleep, but eventually exhaustion took over. I remember checking the time on my phone, 3:17 a.m., before I finally dozed off. I woke up to Kara shaking me. The living room was pitch black, except for the glow of her phone screen. Jenny and Leah were huddled together on one couch, wide-eyed. "Listen," Kara whispered. At first I didn't hear anything. Then I did. A voice, or voices, from outside, near the hill. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it sounded like someone speaking Navajo. Low, gravelly, almost like chanting. "Should we wake Mom and Dad?" I asked. Kara nodded. "I'm going to check on them." "I'll come with you," I said, not wanting her to go alone. "No, stay with them." She nodded toward our cousins. "I'll be right back." I watched as she tiptoed down the hallway with her phone light. The voice outside seemed to get a little louder, but it was still too distant to make out words. I noticed Derek was still asleep somehow, snoring lightly in his sleeping bag. A few minutes later, Kara came rushing back. She looked even more freaked out than before. "Mom's talking in her sleep," she whispered. "She keeps saying Jesus over and over and telling someone to go away." That's when we heard it, scratching at the back door. Not loud, but persistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then a smell hit us. I've smelled roadkill before, and this was similar but worse, like something had died weeks ago and was still rotting. The scratching got more insistent, harder, faster. The smell got stronger. I was about to wake up Derek and run to get my dad when we heard my mom's voice, clear as day, from down the hall. "In Jesus' name, leave this place." The scratching stopped instantly. The smell faded. We all just sat there, frozen, listening. Nothing. No voices outside, no scratching, no smell, just silence. Kara slept on the couch with Jenny and Leah for what remained of the night. I couldn't get back to sleep, so I just sat there until dawn, jumping at every little creak the house made. When morning finally came, my grandpa, Dad, Derek, and I went outside to check things out in the daylight. We went up the hill where we'd seen the figure disappear. There was a flattened circular spot in the grass, about the size of a person sitting cross-legged, but no footprints leading to or from it. Nothing that showed how someone had gotten there or left. While the others were examining the hill, I walked back to check the truck. The girls had left their blankets and pillows in the truck bed when they ran inside. As I was gathering them up, I noticed something on the ground by the truck, Kara's sandal. She must have kicked it off when she scrambled out of the truck bed. When I picked it up, I saw something stuck to the bottom, a clump of hair, long, black, frizzy hair, way more than would normally fall out of someone's head at once. It didn't look like any of our hair. It was coarser, almost like horse hair, but not quite. I brought it to show everyone. My cousins and sister didn't recognize it. Derek thought maybe it was from an animal. My dad and Grandpa looked confused, but my grandma, she took one look at it and her face went white. She snatched it from my hand and walked straight to the fireplace, which she'd relit that morning. "What is it, Grandma?" I asked, following her. She threw the hair into the flames, where it sizzled and gave off a smell like burning plastic. Then she turned to me, her eyes deadly serious. "Skinwalker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was trying to do bad medicine on your sister." My mom tried to dismiss it, told us not to scare ourselves with old stories. But she couldn't explain why she'd been invoking Jesus' name in her sleep, something she said she had no memory of doing. We left my grandparents' place that day, cut our visit short. My parents said it was because of the possibility of an intruder, but I know the real reason. Something was out there that night, something that wasn't human, something that was watching us. I've researched skinwalkers since then. Most of what you find online is garbage, horror stories and fiction, but some Navajo accounts describe them as medicine people who've gone bad, who can take on animal characteristics or transform completely. They're said to move unnaturally fast and have glowing eyes. I don't know what was on that truck that night. I don't know what was scratching at the door or speaking from the hill. I don't know why it targeted my sister or what it wanted, but I know what I saw. I know what I smelled, and I know that every time I visit my grandparents now, I sleep inside with the doors locked and the blinds drawn, and I never, ever look out the window after dark. I still get chills thinking about what happened last summer. I haven't told many people about it because I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar in the Utah desert. My girlfriend Lauren and I were on a road trip through Utah with our German Shepherd Cookie. We're both into hiking and rock formations, so Goblin Valley State Park was high on our list. If you've never been there, it's this surreal landscape with these weird rock formations that look like little creatures. The whole place feels like another planet. We'd been driving for about 7 hours straight from Denver that day. It was getting dark, and we were still about 15 miles from the park entrance where we planned to camp. My eyes were burning from staring at the road for so long, and Lauren and Cookie had both fallen asleep. Lauren curled up against the passenger door, and Cookie sprawled across the back seat of my F-150. I spotted a pull-out area just off the road, not a proper rest stop, just a widened shoulder where you could park safely. It was getting dark fast, and I badly needed to stretch my legs and splash some water on my face before finishing the drive. I pulled over and cut the engine. Lauren didn't even stir. She's always been a heavy sleeper, especially on road trips. I remember looking at her for a moment, her face peaceful in the fading light, before quietly opening my door. Cookie shifted a little in the back seat, but stayed asleep too. The air outside hit me like a wall, that dry desert heat that somehow feels both hot and cool at the same time as the sun goes down. The sky was that deep purple blue you only get in places far from cities, with the first stars already appearing. In the distance, I could see the weird silhouettes of rock formations against the darkening sky. I walked about 20 feet from the truck, just stretching and taking deep breaths. The silence was absolute. No cars, no people, nothing but the occasional desert breeze. That's when Cookie started growling. It wasn't her normal growl. Cookie's usually pretty chill, but she has this specific growl she does when she sees coyotes near our property back home. Low, rumbling, serious. I turned back toward the truck, thinking maybe she'd woken up and spotted something through the window. "What's up, girl?" I called quietly, not wanting to wake Lauren. That's when I heard it. Lauren's voice coming from behind me, from the direction of some scrubby bushes and rocks about 40 feet away. "Come look over here, baby. I found something cool." I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was hearing. I'd just seen Lauren asleep in the truck. There's no way she could have gotten out and walked past me without me noticing. The voice sounded exactly like her, but with this weird echo to it, like it was Lauren's voice but slightly off. "Lauren?" I called, peering toward the darkness where the voice had come from. "Hurry, Jordan, you have to see this," came the reply, still in Lauren's voice but somehow wrong. I started walking toward the voice, confused but curious. Maybe she'd woken up, slipped past me somehow while I was lost in thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. Cookie's growl suddenly erupted into full-blown hysterical barking. Not her alert bark, but her full-on threat bark. The one I've only heard a handful of times when she thought someone was trying to break into our house. Then I heard the real Lauren's voice from the truck, sleepy and confused. "Jordan, what's going on? Why is Cookie freaking out?" My blood turned to ice. I spun around to see Lauren's silhouette sitting up in the passenger seat, looking out the window. That's when it hit me. Hard. Something slammed into me from behind with enough force to knock me flat on my back. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a second, all I could do was gasp for air as I stared up at the darkening sky. Then I saw it standing over me. Even now, months later, I struggled to describe what I saw. It was roughly human-shaped, but wrong in every way. It stood about 6 feet tall on 2 legs, but they weren't human legs. They were oddly jointed, covered in patchy fur. Its face was the worst part, halfway between a woman and a coyote, with a long, hairless snout filled with protruding white teeth. Its eyes were glowing white, not reflecting light like an animal's eyes, but actually emitting a pale glow. It had pointy ears that twitched like a coyote's, and around its shoulders was what looked like a coyote pelt, the head of the dead animal resting on its chest like some fucked-up necklace. The rest of its body was wrapped in what looked like fur, with these strange black and red stripes painted on it. Its hands were almost human, but with long, dirty claws instead of fingernails. And it had a tail, a bushy coyote-like tail that swished behind it as it leaned over me. The smell was overwhelming, like wet dog and rotting meat. It opened its mouth wider than any human mouth could open, jaw unhinging like a snake about to swallow something whole. I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear, though I was terrified beyond anything I've ever felt. It was like I was paralyzed, pinned not just by its weight, but by those glowing eyes. They seemed to hold me in place, my muscles refusing to respond. I heard myself make a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like a whimper. The thing's face twisted into what might have been a smile. Then Cookie hit it like a furry missile. 1 second the creature was above me. The next it was tumbling sideways with 85 pounds of pissed-off German shepherd latched onto its arm. Cookie was snarling like I've never heard her snarl before, all teeth and fury. The paralysis broke. I scrambled backward on all fours, gasping. The creature made a sound, not a growl or a scream, but something in between, high-pitched and warbling. It flung Cookie off with unnatural strength, sending her tumbling. But Cookie is part of our family for a reason. She was back on her feet in an instant, placing herself between me and the thing, hackles raised, teeth bared. The creature hesitated, those white eyes flicking between me and Cookie. "Jordan, run!" Lauren was screaming from the truck. I got to my feet, nearly falling again on wobbly legs. "Cookie, come!" I yelled, backing toward the truck. Cookie started backing up too, still facing the creature, still growling. The thing took a step forward, then another. Cookie lunged, snapping, and it jumped back with surprising agility. That gave us the opening we needed. I turned and ran for the truck, Cookie right beside me. I yanked open the driver's door, and Cookie leaped in first, scrambling over the center console. I threw myself in after her, slamming the door and hitting the locks. Lauren was pressed against her door, eyes wide with terror. "What the fuck is that thing?" she screamed. The creature was approaching the truck, moving in this weird, loping gait that was neither human nor animal. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to get them in the ignition. "It's coming!" Lauren shrieked. The engine roared to life. I threw the truck into drive and slammed on the gas. The tires spun in the gravel before catching, and we shot forward onto the road. I didn't bother with headlights or checking for other cars. I just wanted distance between us and that thing. In the rearview mirror, I could see it standing in the middle of the road, watching us go. Even from that distance, those white eyes seemed to glow. What the fuck was that? Lauren was hyperventilating, Cookie whining and pacing in the back seat. "I don't know," I managed, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know." I was driving way too fast for the dark desert road, probably 80 in a 55 zone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. We'd gone maybe 5 miles when it happened. A cow appeared in the headlights. In Utah, there's open rangeland where cattle can wander freely, even across highways. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. We hit the cow at about 65 mph. The impact was tremendous. The airbags deployed, and for a few seconds, everything was chaos. When things settled, the truck was stalled in the middle of the road. The front end was crushed, steam hissing from the radiator. Through the cracked windshield, I could see the cow lying in the road about 20 feet ahead, still alive and making these horrible moaning sounds. "Are you okay?" I asked Lauren, who was holding her wrist. "I think so. Just banged my arm on the dash. Is Cookie okay?" Cookie whined from the back seat, but seemed uninjured. "Stay here," I said, reaching under the seat for the small caliber pistol I keep for emergencies. "I need to take care of the cow. It's suffering." Lauren nodded, tears in her eyes. I opened the door and stepped out, legs still shaky from everything that had happened. The cow was lying on its side, breathing heavily, eyes wide with pain. I felt sick. I'd never killed an animal before, but I couldn't leave it suffering like that. I approached slowly, gun in hand, trying to remember what I'd heard about the most humane way to put down injured cattle. That's when I noticed the other cows. There were at least a dozen of them, standing eerily still along both sides of the road, watching me. In the moonlight, their eyes reflected back like silver coins. It wasn't normal. Cattle don't gather and watch like that. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I heard something moving in the brush beside the road. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Cookie started barking frantically from inside the truck. I turned, raising the gun, and there it was again. The creature. The same one from before, or maybe another like it. It had somehow gotten ahead of us or followed us impossibly fast. It stood at the edge of the road, those white eyes fixed on me. Its jaw was hanging open, more unnaturally than before, as if partially dislocated. I realized with horror that it had driven the cattle onto the road. It had wanted us to crash. I aimed the gun with trembling hands, but I couldn't pull the trigger. Something about those eyes. They seemed to reach into my head, making it hard to think, hard to act. It took a step toward me, then another. I was frozen again, just like before. Then headlights appeared in the distance, coming toward us. The creature's head snapped toward the approaching vehicle, and in an instant it was gone, vanishing into the darkness beside the road. The approaching vehicle slowed and stopped. It was a BLM ranger in a government pickup. He got out, flashlight in hand. "You folks all right?" he called, approaching cautiously. I lowered the gun, suddenly aware how it must look. "Hit a cow," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. The ranger assessed the situation quickly. The injured cow, our damaged truck, Lauren and Cookie still in the vehicle. He radioed for a tow truck, then asked if I had a weapon to put the cow down or if I wanted him to do it. I handed him the gun. My hands were shaking too badly to trust my aim. While the ranger took care of the cow, I kept scanning the darkness, expecting to see those white eyes watching us. But there was nothing, just the unnervingly still cattle that had started to disperse. "You're lucky," the ranger said when he returned my gun. "People get killed hitting cattle out here. What were you doing driving so fast after dark in open range country?" I thought about telling him the truth, about the creature that had lured me with Lauren's voice, about how it had somehow driven the cattle into our path. But I knew how it would sound. "Just not thinking straight," I said instead. "Long day of driving." He nodded and wrote me a ticket for hitting a cow on open range land. I accepted it without complaint. It seemed like a small price to pay. The tow truck arrived about an hour later. We got towed to the nearest town, got a motel room, and spent a sleepless night with the lights on and Cookie alert at the foot of the bed. We never made it to Goblin Valley. We rented a car the next day and drove straight back to Denver, barely speaking about what happened. Here's the thing that really freaks me out, though. Sometimes I dream about those eyes, those hypnotic white eyes. And in the dreams, I'm not afraid. I'm fascinated. Sometimes I wake up with this weird urge to go back to that stretch of road near Goblin Valley. Like something is calling me. Lauren doesn't want to talk about it anymore. She says it was probably just some crazy person in a costume who tried to attack me, and the stress of the situation made me see something supernatural. Cookie still gets agitated whenever coyotes are nearby, more than she used to. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I wonder if it knows me too. If it's still out there waiting, and part of me, a part I don't like to acknowledge, wonders what would happen if I answered that call. I haven't told anyone but you guys about this. Am I going crazy? Has anyone else encountered something like this in Utah? The locals call that area skinwalker country, but I never believed in any of that stuff before. Now I'm not so sure. I can't bring myself to go camping anymore, especially not in the desert. I used to love it. The fresh air, the stars, the feeling of being disconnected from everything. Now, just the thought of sleeping in a tent makes my heart race. What happened at Black Mesa changed me forever, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. This was back in May, about 8 months ago. I joined a small caravan heading to the Navajo reservation in Arizona with my friend Charlie and some people from his anthropology program. Charlie had connections with a Navajo family, who allowed small groups to stay on their land near Black Mesa. The son, Johnny, was in Charlie's program, and his family had this compound with a few buildings, including a traditional hogan where his parents lived. I'd never been to that part of the country before and was excited to explore the landscape. I've always been interested in indigenous cultures, and Johnny had agreed to show us around and teach us about Navajo traditions. We arrived in the late afternoon after a long drive from Denver. There were 7 of us total: me, Charlie, Johnny, and 4 others from the university. We set up our tents a respectful distance from the compound. Johnny's dad had some sheep, and we were helping herd them into a small enclosure for the night when one of the younger lambs got spooked and bolted. Without thinking, I volunteered to go after it. Johnny pointed in the direction it ran and said not to go too far beyond the ridge if I couldn't find it. I jogged after the lamb, following its tracks in the dry soil. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The terrain was rough, all these little arroyos cutting through the earth with juniper and piñon trees dotting the hillsides. I kept catching glimpses of the lamb's white coat ahead of me, but it was surprisingly fast. Before I knew it, I'd crested the ridge Johnny had mentioned and lost sight of the compound behind me. I could still see the lamb's tracks leading down into a narrow arroyo, so I decided to follow it just a bit further. The walls of the arroyo weren't very high, maybe 6 feet at most. But once I was down in it, I couldn't see much beyond what was directly in front of me. I followed the arroyo for maybe 10 minutes, still seeing occasional tracks, when I realized the sun had nearly set and the light was fading fast. I decided to turn back, but when I reached a fork in the arroyo, I couldn't remember which way I'd come from. Both paths looked identical in the dim light. That's when I felt the first tightness in my chest, the beginning of an asthma attack. I hadn't had one in years, and of course my inhaler was back in my tent. I tried to stay calm, taking slow breaths, but the combination of the elevation, we were at least 6,000 feet, the exertion from running, and now the panic of realizing I was lost, triggered a full-blown attack. I climbed out of the arroyo, hoping to spot the lights from the compound, but all I could see were miles of darkening desert in every direction. No lights, no landmarks I recognized, nothing. The pain in my chest worsened as I struggled to breathe. My vision started tunneling, and I felt lightheaded. The last thing I remember was sinking to my knees, trying desperately to get air into my lungs before everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, it was fully dark. The desert night was cold, much colder than I'd expected, and I was shivering. The attack had subsided, but my chest still hurt, and my throat felt raw. Above me, the stars were incredible, more than I'd ever seen before, with the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. I sat up slowly, trying to orient myself. The moon was bright enough to see by, casting everything in silvery light and deep shadows. I was on a slight rise, with arroyos and low hills all around me. I had no idea which direction the compound was in, but I knew I needed to find help before another asthma attack hit, or the temperature dropped further. I stood up, brushing dirt from my jeans, and that's when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned toward the sound. About 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a juniper tree, was a figure. In the moonlight, I could make out someone watching me. I couldn't see details, just a dark silhouette, but it was definitely person-shaped. My first thought was relief. Someone from the caravan had come looking for me. Charlie or Johnny must have organized a search party when I didn't return. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. I got lost following one of the lambs. Can you help me get back to the compound?" The figure didn't respond, but shifted slightly behind the tree. I took a tentative step forward. "Charlie? Is that you?" I had an asthma attack and passed out. After a moment, the figure stepped out from behind the tree. In the moonlight, I could make out what looked like Charlie's silhouette, the same height and build, wearing what appeared to be the red flannel shirt he'd had on earlier. He didn't speak, but raised an arm and motioned for me to follow before turning and walking away. I was confused by his silence, but relieved to have found someone. Maybe he was just focused on getting us back, or maybe he was annoyed that I'd wandered off and gotten lost. I followed him, picking my way carefully over the uneven ground. "How far are we from camp?" I called after him, but he didn't answer, just kept walking at a steady pace. We walked for what felt like 5 or 10 minutes, moving through the moonlit landscape. Charlie stayed about 20 feet ahead of me the whole time, never speaking, just occasionally stopping to make sure I was still following before continuing on. I was starting to get an uneasy feeling. Why wouldn't he talk to me? And the way he moved was off somehow, too fluid, too purposeful. Charlie normally had this slight slouch when he walked, but this figure was perfectly upright. That's when I noticed someone else ahead of us, another figure standing on a small rise about 50 yards away. This person seemed to materialize out of nowhere, and I couldn't make out who it was, just another dark silhouette against the night sky. "Charlie, who's that?" I called out, but again no response. A sudden sharp pain shot through my head, the most intense headache I've ever experienced. It was like someone had driven an ice pick into my temple. I stumbled, pressing my palm against my forehead. When I looked up again, there were 3 more figures standing in a semicircle ahead of us. Something was very wrong. In the moonlight, I could now see that these weren't people at all. They were shaped like large coyotes, but something about them was deeply unnatural. Their proportions weren't right. Too tall, too thin, and their eyes caught the moonlight and reflected it back with an eerie amber glow. I looked back at Charlie, who had stopped about 10 feet ahead of me. In the stronger moonlight here, I could see that while the silhouette resembled my friend, the details were all wrong. The face was too smooth, featureless in the shadows, and the movements as it turned toward me were wrong, like a puppet being controlled by strings. Pure terror washed over me. I didn't know what these things were, but every cell in my body was screaming at me to run, so I did. I turned and sprinted back the way we'd come, or at least what I thought was the way we'd come. My chest burned and my head pounded, but fear pushed me forward. I ran blindly through the desert, stumbling over rocks and brush, tearing my jeans and scratching my hands when I fell, but immediately scrambling back up to keep running. After about 5 minutes, my lungs were on fire, and I had to stop. I bent over, hands on my knees, desperately trying to catch my breath without triggering another asthma attack. The night was silent except for my ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. Slowly, I straightened up and looked behind me. At first, I saw nothing, and a wave of relief washed over me. Then I spotted it, one of the coyote figures standing on a ridgeline about 100 yards back, its silhouette clear against the starry sky. As I watched, frozen in horror, the thing stood up on its hind legs. It rose up, impossibly tall and thin, like a nightmare version of a coyote. And then it opened its mouth and screamed. The sound that came out wasn't natural. It started like a coyote howl, but amplified 100 times, like it was being broadcast through a giant megaphone with some kind of distortion effect. The scream echoed across the desert, bouncing off the mesas and cliffs. surrounding me with this horrific noise that seemed to vibrate inside my skull and made my headache even worse. I ran again. I don't know how long or how far. My lungs were burning. My head was pounding so hard I could barely see, and I was certain those things were right behind me. I kept running until I stumbled onto what felt like packed dirt under my feet. A road. Not paved, but definitely a road. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere with people. After about 10 minutes, I saw headlights in the distance coming toward me. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The vehicle, a pickup truck, slowed and stopped. The driver was a middle-aged Navajo man in work clothes with a Peabody Coal logo. He rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. I must have looked terrible, dirt-covered, scratched up, wild-eyed. I babbled something about getting lost from Johnny's compound and needing a ride back. He let me in the truck, eyeing me warily, probably wondering if I was on drugs. He said he knew where Johnny's family lived and would take me there. As we started driving, I glanced in the side mirror and saw them. A pair of amber eyes reflecting the truck's brake lights, standing just at the edge of the darkness beyond the road. I didn't say anything to the driver. I was afraid he'd stop, or worse, think I was crazy and refuse to take me back. The drive took about 20 minutes, which meant I'd wandered incredibly far from the compound. When we pulled up, I saw Charlie and Johnny outside with flashlights, obviously searching for me. I thanked the driver and practically fell out of the truck. Charlie ran over, asking where I'd been and saying they'd been searching for hours. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he'd never left the compound. He'd been here the whole time, looking for me. Whatever had been leading me through the desert, it hadn't been Charlie. Instead of answering his questions, I asked where Johnny's parents were. Something inside me knew they would understand what had happened. Johnny pointed to the hogan, the traditional Navajo dwelling where his parents lived, and started to say that non-Navajos weren't supposed to enter, but I was already running toward it. I burst inside without knocking, breaking all kinds of cultural taboos. Johnny's parents were sitting by a small fire in the center of the round room. They looked up, startled. Between sobs and gasps for breath, I told them everything about following the lamb, passing out, the fake Charlie, and the coyote things that stood like men. Johnny's father's face turned ashen as I spoke. His mother immediately got up and went to a small chest in the corner of the room. She took out a bag of what looked like ashes and a .357 revolver. She began dipping bullets into the ashes while singing quietly in Navajo, what sounded like some kind of prayer. Johnny came in after me, apologizing to his parents for my intrusion, but his father waved him off. "She's seen the skinwalkers," he said simply. "She must stay inside tonight." They made up a place for me to sleep right there in the hogan, breaking their own rules to keep me safe. Johnny's father explained very little, just that what I'd seen were evil beings that could take different forms to lure people away, and that I was lucky to have escaped. His mother kept the loaded revolver next to her all night. I barely slept, jumping at every sound outside. At dawn, Johnny's parents called a medicine man who came and performed some kind of ceremony over me that I didn't fully understand. He sprinkled me with a powder that smelled like sage and cedar and sang for what felt like hours. Afterward, Johnny told us we needed to leave. The trip had been planned for a week, but his father insisted we pack up and go that day. As we loaded our vehicles, Johnny pulled me aside. "The skinwalkers found you once," he said quietly. "They won't bother you anymore once you leave here, but don't come back, and don't speak of them after today." I haven't spoken about it until now. I don't know what those things were, skinwalkers, as Johnny's family called them, or something else. I don't know why they targeted me or what they wanted. All I know is that the image of that coyote thing standing upright on the ridge, letting out that terrible scream, is burned into my memory. I still have nightmares where I'm following the fake Charlie through the desert, toward those glowing eyes waiting in the darkness. I wake up with that same crushing headache I felt that night, and sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear something scratching at my window, like claws trying to find a way in. I still can't sleep properly. It's been 3 weeks since my trip to Arizona, and every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes staring back at me. I'm writing this down, hoping it might help me process what happened, because honestly, I'm starting to question my own sanity. I was on a road trip through the Southwest, doing some wildlife photography. I'm no professional, just an enthusiast with a decent camera and too much free time since getting laid off. I'd been on the road for about 2 weeks, camping most nights to save money, when I reached Kayenta, Arizona, on the edge of the Navajo Nation. It was late afternoon when I pulled into town. The sun was starting to sink, casting this deep orange glow over everything. I was hungry and tired from driving all day, so when I saw a place called Pizza Edge, I figured I'd grab something to eat before finding somewhere to sleep for the night. The restaurant was in this weathered strip mall with a gravel parking lot. As I pulled in, I noticed an old Navajo man sleeping on a bench outside. Nothing unusual about that, except for the dog sitting next to him. Something about this dog immediately caught my attention. It was watching me intently as I parked my Subaru. I can't exactly explain why, but something felt off about it. It wasn't a res dog like the others I'd seen around. Those tend to look kind of mangy and underfed. This one had a thick, grayish-brown coat, almost coyote-like, but it was bigger, much bigger, and it sat perfectly still, just watching. When I got out of my car, I looked directly at it, and that's when I noticed its eyes. They didn't look like dog eyes at all. They were amber-colored but somehow human, like there was an intelligence behind them that no dog should have. It didn't blink when we made eye contact, and I swear to God it felt like it was sizing me up. I quickly looked away and hurried inside, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. The pizza place was almost empty, just a couple of teenagers in one booth and a family in another. I ordered a personal pizza and a Coke, then sat at a table facing the window so I could keep an eye on my car. The dog was still there, sitting next to the sleeping man, but now it seemed to be staring directly at the restaurant door. While waiting for my pizza, I scrolled through the photos I'd taken earlier that day. The waitress, a young Navajo woman, brought my food and noticed the wildlife shots on my camera. "You a photographer?" she asked. "Just a hobby," I replied. "Been documenting wildlife on my trip." She nodded, glancing at my screen. "Be careful out there. Some things don't like their picture taken." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't smile back, just gave me this serious look before walking away. At the time, I brushed it off as local superstition. I ate quickly, occasionally glancing outside. The dog hadn't moved, and the old man was still asleep. As I paid my bill, I asked the cashier about camping spots nearby. "There's no official campground," he said, "but people sometimes park out by the old pond where the draws meet, about 7 miles east of town. Just stay on the main road until you see the big lightning-struck juniper, then take the dirt track to the left." I thanked him and headed outside. The sun was setting now, and I wanted to find this spot before dark. As I approached my car, I realized the old man was gone, and so was the dog. Relieved, I unlocked my car and tossed my camera bag onto the passenger seat. That's when I heard a scratching sound behind me. I turned around and nearly had a heart attack. The dog was standing on its hind legs. Not just standing, but actively trying to reach the door handle of my car. It was at least 6 feet tall in this position. Its front paws, or hands, they looked disturbingly like hands, were stretching toward my door. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous for a normal dog. But those eyes, those human eyes in that animal face, that's what made me cry out. When I shouted, it immediately dropped to all fours and bolted away, disappearing between 2 buildings faster than anything that size should move. I stood there trembling, keys clutched in my hand so tight they were digging into my palm. A voice inside me screamed to get in the car and drive straight out of town, to not stop until I reached a big city with bright lights and lots of people. But another part of me rationalized that I was tired, that the strange light at sunset was playing tricks, that maybe it was just a stray dog jumping up against my car because it smelled the pizza I was carrying. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down. Looking back, I should have listened to my instincts and kept driving, but I didn't. Instead, I decided to follow the cashier's directions to the camping spot. 7 miles wasn't far. I'd be away from town, in an open area where I could see anything approaching. As I drove east out of Kayenta, the landscape opened up into this vast, empty expanse. The sunset was almost gone now, just a thin line of deep red on the horizon. On both sides of the road, the desert stretched out, dotted with scrubby juniper and sage. No houses, no lights, nothing but empty land. About 5 miles out, I spotted something on the road. Roadkill. It looked like a coyote that had been hit recently. For some reason, I stopped. I'm still not sure why. Maybe my photographer's brain thought it would make an interesting composition for my wildlife documentation. Whatever the reason, I pulled over, put on my gloves, and dragged the carcass off the road. As I continued driving, I came across more roadkill. 2 skunks, a raccoon, and what looked like a fox. Each time I stopped and moved them, placing them all in a field near where I eventually parked for the night. In hindsight, this was incredibly stupid, like I was setting up a buffet for scavengers. I found the lightning-struck juniper easily enough. It stood alone, split down the middle but still alive, its twisted form silhouetted against the darkening sky. The dirt track beside it led to exactly the kind of spot the cashier had described, a small natural basin where 2 draws met, creating a depression that held a pond about the size of a backyard swimming pool. I parked with my car facing outward, a habit from years of camping alone. It gave me a clear view of the approach and meant I could leave quickly if needed. The night had turned cool, and the sky was incredible. No light pollution, just millions of stars and a thin crescent moon that provided just enough light to see by. I didn't set up a tent. I never do when car camping alone. It's safer to sleep in the vehicle where I can lock the doors. I reclined my seat, ate some snacks I had packed, and scrolled through my photos from the day. Around 10 p.m. I put everything away, used my portable camping toilet behind the car, and settled in to sleep with my windows cracked just enough for air. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It might have been hours or just minutes. What I do know is that something woke me, a sound outside my car. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it more clearly. Footsteps, human footsteps, walking slowly around my vehicle. My heart started racing immediately. I was miles from town, completely alone. Nobody knew I was here except the cashier at the pizza place. I lay perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would think I was asleep or just move on. The footsteps circled my car once, then stopped right outside my window. I could hear breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing. I had a flashlight in the center console, one of those heavy-duty tactical ones that could also serve as a weapon if needed. Slowly, I reached for it, trying not to make any sudden movements. The breathing continued, now accompanied by a soft scratching on the window. It sounded like nails or claws dragging lightly across the glass. I clutched the flashlight, took a deep breath, and in one quick motion sat up and shined it out the window. What I saw will haunt me until the day I die. It was the dog from town, but not a dog at all. It was standing upright on two legs, its body elongated and twisted in a way no normal canine could manage. Its front paws had extended into these horrible hand-like appendages with long fingers ending in curved claws. Its face was pushed forward into a snout, but those eyes, those unmistakably human eyes, were staring right at me with an intelligence that seemed to say, "I found you." It pressed its face against my window, fogging up the glass with its breath. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of teeth that no dog should have. They were almost serrated, like a shark's. And then it smiled. I swear to God this thing smiled at me, a grotesque parody of a human expression on its canine face. I was frozen, completely paralyzed with fear. It kept staring, its eyes never blinking, as it slowly raised one of its hand paws and tapped on my window with what looked like a finger. Tap, 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 like it was asking to be let in. That broke my trance. I scrambled into the driver's seat, dropping the flashlight in my panic. The creature immediately reacted, moving to the driver's side door. I could hear it scratching, trying to find a way in. I fumbled with my keys, struggling to get them into the ignition while keeping my eyes on the creature as it circled the car. It tried the door handles, pulling at them with those horrible finger things. Thank God I'd locked the doors. The windows were still cracked a few inches, and I saw its claws trying to work their way into the gap. I finally got the key in and turned it, but the engine sputtered and didn't catch. Come on, I pleaded, turning the key again. The creature was at my window now, its face inches from mine with just the glass between us. Its breath fogged the window as it watched me struggle with the ignition. The smile was gone, replaced with what I can only describe as hunger. The third time the engine roared to life. I didn't even wait to let it warm up. I threw it into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the dirt before finding purchase, and I shot forward onto the track. In my rearview mirror, I could see the creature standing there watching me leave. Then, to my horror, it dropped to all fours and started running after me. It was fast, unnaturally fast. I hit the main road and gunned it, the speedometer pushing 70, 80, 90 on the empty desert highway. And still, in my mirrors, I could see it coming, sometimes on all fours, sometimes rising up to run on two legs in a loping, unnatural gait. I didn't slow down until I hit the interstate, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors obsessively. I drove straight through until morning, not stopping until I reached Flagstaff, where I pulled into a busy truck stop and finally allowed myself to breathe. I've tried researching what I might have seen that night. The closest thing I can find is something called a skinwalker in Navajo lore, a witch that can transform into an animal. Or maybe it was what cryptozoologists call a dogman. I don't know. I don't care what it's called. I just know it was real, and it was hunting me. I haven't been able to look at dogs the same way since then. Every time I see one, I look at its eyes. Terrified, I'll recognize that human intelligence staring back at me. I've thought about reporting what happened, but who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I'm sharing this here as a warning. If you're traveling through Navajo country or anywhere remote, really, be careful where you stop for the night. Don't move roadkill. Don't attract attention. And if you see a dog that doesn't quite look right, with eyes that seem too aware, get away as fast as you can. Because these things are real, and they're watching, waiting for the opportunity to catch someone alone. And whatever you do, don't deliberately try to seek these creatures out like some kind of paranormal tourist. They're not a curiosity or a thrill. They're predators. And to them, we're just another meal. I still don't know why it didn't attack me in the parking lot when I first saw it. Maybe there were too many people around. Maybe it was waiting for me to be completely isolated. All I know is that I'm never going back to Arizona, and I sleep with my bedroom door locked and a baseball bat beside my bed. Sometimes at night, I swear I can hear scratching at my window, and I wonder if it followed me home. I'm sharing this because I need to tell someone. Most people outside our reservation wouldn't understand, but I hope you will. Growing up on the res, you learn the rules quickly. Our community has always had two that were non-negotiable. Never look outside at night and never be outside after dark. As kids, we didn't question it much. It was just part of life, like knowing not to touch a hot stove. My grandmother would say, "The night belongs to others," and that was that. My brother Micah never was good at following rules. He was 16, 2 years older than me, when everything happened. I remember that night in February because it had been unusually warm for a few days, melting most of the snow before the temperature dropped again. Micah had been sneaking out to see Layla, a girl who lived about a half-mile from us. Mom would have killed him if she knew, not because of Layla, she was nice, but because being outside at night was forbidden, not just by our mom, but by everyone. The elders especially were strict about it. That night, I was half awake when I heard Micah's window slide open around 2 a.m. Our house was small, just a single-story place with 3 bedrooms, and the walls were thin. I heard the soft thud of his feet hitting the floor and whispered, "You're gonna get caught." "Go back to sleep," he whispered back. I dozed off but woke again to hear Micah's return. I could tell something was wrong. Usually he was so quiet, but this time he practically tumbled through his window. I heard a thump, then quick footsteps, and then Mom's voice from the hallway. "What are you doing up?" she asked. I got out of bed and peeked through my cracked door. Micah was standing there, still wearing his jacket, looking pale. Mom was in her nightgown, hair messy from sleep. "I heard something," Micah said, voice shaking. "Outside my window." Mom frowned. "What were you doing at your window?" Micah hesitated, then confessed. "I went to see Layla. I was climbing back in when I heard Shiloh growling behind me." Shiloh was our dog, a big German shepherd mix who slept outside most nights in his little shelter by the side of the house. "But he wasn't growling at me," Micah continued. "He was looking up, above my window, at the roof." Mom's face changed. I'd never seen her look so scared. "There was something up there," Micah said. "I could feel it watching me. I heard it, shifting its weight, like it was sitting on the edge right above me." Mom grabbed his shoulders. "Did you see it? Did you look at it?" "No, I just got inside as fast as I could." She pulled him into a hug, but I could see she was shaking. "Don't ever do that again," she said. "Keep your window closed and locked at night. Always." The next morning, no one mentioned it. Mom made breakfast like nothing happened, but she looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. Micah was quiet too. Later that day, when Mom went to the store, Micah told me everything. He described how he'd been halfway through his window when Shiloh started that low, warning growl. When he looked back, Shiloh was staring up at the roof, hackles raised. It was like he was afraid to bark, Micah said. And then I heard it, this scraping sound like nails or claws on the shingles, and breathing, heavy breathing, right above me. What was it? I asked. I don't know, but I felt it watching me. He shuddered, like it was deciding whether to grab me or not. After that night, things changed. Micah stopped sneaking out. He pushed his dresser in front of his window and started sleeping with the light on. But what really freaked me out was how the story spread. About a week later, our uncle came over. I overheard him talking to Mom in the kitchen. "Heard Micah had a visitor," he said quietly. Mom shushed him. "The kids might hear. They should know, Sarah, especially if it's coming around your house." "It was just once," Mom said, "because Micah was outside at night." "It's not just your place," Uncle said. "The Big Gays heard it on their roof last week, and old Mrs. Tsosi says it's been walking around her house almost every night." I didn't understand then what they were talking about, but over the next few months I heard more stories. People in the community started sharing experiences about what they called the thing that walks among us at night. They'd talk in low voices when kids were around, but we still heard things. The summer after Micah's experience, our cousin Damon stayed with us for a few weeks. He was in his 20s and not usually the type to get spooked. One night, after Mom thought I was asleep, I heard him telling her about something that happened to him and our great-aunt Lena. "I was staying at Auntie's place," Damon said. "She'd gone to bed early, and I was up watching TV. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the roof. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch scraping. But then it got louder, heavy steps, moving from one end of the house to the other." Mom made a sound, and Damon continued. "I called out to Auntie, thinking maybe she'd gotten up. She came out of her room looking scared. She whispered, 'It's here again.' And then the footsteps started following her movements. When she moved to the kitchen, the steps went there too, right above her. When she went to the bathroom, they followed. It was tracking her, Aunt Sarah." "What did you do?" Mom asked. "Auntie pulled me into her bedroom and locked the door. She started praying and burning sage. The footsteps stopped right above us and stayed there for hours, like it was waiting. I've never been so scared in my life. I lay awake for a long time after that, listening for sounds on our roof. The years passed, and I mostly forgot about it. Micah joined the Army after high school, and I went to college in Arizona. When I came back to the reservation at 23, I moved into my own place, a small house that had belonged to my grandfather before he passed. That's when it started for me. It was my first winter back. We'd had a light snow, and I was up late working on my laptop. Around 5 a.m. I heard it, heavy footsteps on my roof. At first, I thought it was snow falling off the branches onto the house, but then the steps became more deliberate, slow, methodical, crossing from one side to the other. I froze, remembering all the stories I'd heard growing up. The footsteps stopped right above where I was sitting. Then came a sound like something heavy being dragged. I shut off all the lights and sat in the dark, barely breathing, until sunrise. After that, it became a regular thing, especially when snow was falling. Always around 5 a.m., that same heavy walking. Sometimes it would be different. What sounded like a grown man in steel-toe boots running across my roof, with chains dragging behind him. The first few times, I called my mom in a panic, and she'd come over and stay until morning. I tried everything. I put crosses up. I burned sage and sweetgrass. My cousin's wife, who was Catholic, gave me holy water, which I sprinkled on my ceiling. That seemed to work for a few days, but then it came back. The worst part wasn't the footsteps. It was the feeling that came with them, this overwhelming sense of dread and the certainty that whatever was up there was malevolent. It wanted in. It wanted me to look at it, to acknowledge it somehow. I wasn't the only one experiencing it. My neighbor Tom, a tough guy who worked construction and didn't believe in superstitious nonsense, as he called it, came over one morning looking shaken. "Did you hear anything last night?" he asked. I knew immediately what he meant. "On your roof?" He nodded. I was sitting in my living room watching the game when it started. Footsteps right above me. Then it just stopped, like it was standing there, listening. I couldn't move. I sat there for 2 hours, too scared to even get up and turn off the TV. Another neighbor, Maria, told me she'd been taking out garbage one night when she heard walking above her doorway. She dropped the bag and ran inside, locking the door behind her. She didn't go outside after dark for months after that. Last winter was the worst. The thing came almost every night for a week straight. Sometimes it would just walk around, but other nights it would scratch at my ceiling like it was trying to dig through. One night it pounded so hard my ceiling light fixture shook. I finally went to talk to one of our elders, Mr. Begay. He's in his 80s now and knows all the old stories. I told him everything that had been happening. He wasn't surprised. "These beings have always been here," he said. "Before the houses, they walked the forests and mesas. Now they walk our roofs." "What are they?" I asked. "Not what, who," he corrected me. "They were people once, long ago, bad people who did terrible things. Now they're trapped between worlds, looking for ways back in. How do I make it stop?" "You don't," he said simply. "You respect the old rules. You don't look outside at night. You don't go out after dark, and you never, ever call to them or try to see them." "What happens if you see one?" I asked. Mr. Begay was quiet for a long time. "Those who see them don't usually talk about it afterward. The ones who do are never the same." He told me about his uncle, who'd been curious about the roof walkers. One night in the 1950s, the uncle set up a ladder outside his house and climbed up to see what was making the noise. No one knows what he saw, but they found him the next morning sitting in his kitchen, staring at nothing. He never spoke another word for the rest of his life. I've moved twice since then, but it doesn't matter. The thing finds me. Not every night, but often enough that I've learned to live with it. I keep sage burning when I sleep. I never look out windows after sunset. I make sure all my curtains are closed before dark. Last month it snowed heavily for the first time this season. I was up late, working on a project, when the familiar footsteps started. But this time, they were different, lighter, almost playful, like it was happy about something. Then I heard a second set of footsteps joining the first, 2 of them walking in sync across my roof. I texted my mom. "There's 2 now." She called me immediately. "Come stay with me," she said, "right now." I gathered some things and drove to her house, staying in my car with the engine running and lights on until she opened the door. I didn't look up once. That night, as we sat in her living room with all the lights on, she finally told me why our community is so strict about the night rules. "These things," she said, "they're getting stronger. When I was a girl, you'd only hear them once or twice a year. Now they're everywhere, all the time. People think it's because we're forgetting the old ways, the protections." "What do they want?" I asked. "To come back," she said, "to be let in. and they can only do that if someone invites them, looks at them directly. Has anyone ever seen what they look like? She hesitated. Your grandfather did, once. This surprised me. My grandfather had never mentioned anything like this to me. He was young, about Micah's age when it happened to him. He heard one on the roof and got curious. He went outside with a flashlight and looked up. What did he see? He would never say exactly, just that it had a face that wasn't quite right and eyes that glowed like embers. She shuddered. After that night, he built this house with no windows facing the forest side, and he taught us the rules. I've been staying with Mom for a month now. Sometimes we still hear them at night, but it feels safer together. Micah came home on leave last week, and we told him everything. He admitted he's been hearing them too, even on base in Kentucky, like they followed him there. I'm writing this because people need to know. These things are real, and they're spreading. They're not just on the reservation anymore. I've heard stories from friends in Phoenix, in Denver, even as far as Chicago. So if you ever hear footsteps on your roof at night, especially when it's snowing, don't look out. Don't try to see what's making the noise. Keep your windows locked and your curtains closed. Because if they know you're listening, they'll keep coming back. And if they know you're looking for them, they might find a way inside. And right now, as I'm typing this, I can hear something moving across the roof above me. It's been snowing all day, and the footsteps are heavier than usual. It's stopping now, right above where I'm sitting. There's a scratching sound. It knows I'm talking about it. I'm still struggling to write this. My hands are shaking. But I need to get it out there because I don't think I'll make it through another Christmas. Maybe someone here has seen something similar or knows what to do. God, I hope so. This happened last year in Pine Ridge. It's a small town where everyone knows each other and nothing exciting ever happens. I moved there a few years ago to be closer to my sister Sarah after her divorce. She has a daughter, Bethany, who was 10 at the time. Sweet kid, smart, creative, always making up stories and games. Sarah and I were never super close growing up, but Bethany and I hit it off right away. She called me her cool uncle, and I'd watch her after school sometimes when Sarah was working late shifts at the hospital. I'd take her for ice cream, help with homework, normal uncle stuff. Last December, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Bethany started telling me about an elf. Not like the elf on the shelf thing that parents put around the house. She said this one was different. It would hide in her house and watch her. At first, I thought Sarah had bought one of those elf dolls as a Christmas surprise. But when I casually mentioned it to her, she looked confused and said they didn't have any elf decorations in the house. Bethany's probably just making it up, Sarah said. Her imagination has been running wild lately. I dropped it. Kids make up stuff all the time, right? But Bethany kept talking about this elf, and her stories started getting weirder. She said it watched her from her dollhouse with empty glass eyes. It would only move when she wasn't looking at it. The elf changed, she told me one afternoon while I was helping her with math homework. After that night, it turned bad. The way she said it made my skin crawl. What do you mean, Bethy? Her voice got really quiet. It moves around my room at night. I can hear it. It makes this weird noise like scratching and clicking. I tried to laugh it off. Probably just the house settling, kiddo. She shook her head really hard. No, it's the elf. And if I try to get out of bed at night, it bites me and claws at my feet and ankles. That's when I got concerned. I asked her to show me, thinking maybe she had scratched herself in her sleep or something. But when she pulled up her pajama pants, I saw these small, crescent-shaped marks around her ankles. Some were scabbed over, others looked fresh. There were also long, thin scratches running up her calves. Jesus, Bethany, what happened? I told you, The elf did it. It has too many teeth. They're long and thin and pointy, and it has long, sharp nails like claws. I immediately called Sarah, who came home early from work. She examined the marks and got really upset, not at the elf story, but at Bethany. "Are you doing this to yourself?" she demanded. "This isn't funny, Bethany." Bethany started crying, insisting it was the elf. Sarah took her to a doctor the next day. The doctor suggested that Bethany might be experiencing some kind of stress-induced self-harm and recommended a child psychologist. Sarah scheduled an appointment, but it wasn't until after the holidays. I was worried sick. I'd always been close to Bethany, and the idea that she might be hurting herself was horrifying. But part of me couldn't shake this weird feeling. The marks on her legs didn't look self-inflicted. They were in places that would be hard for her to reach, and some were deep. Over the next few days, Bethany got worse. She wasn't sleeping. She had dark circles under her eyes and jumped at small noises. She refused to be alone in her room, even during the day. Sarah was at her wits' end, torn between work, the holidays, and her increasingly troubled daughter. When Christmas Eve came around, I offered to stay over. Sarah was working the night shift at the hospital. They were short-staffed, and she couldn't get out of it. She was grateful and hoped having me there might help Bethany feel safer. That evening, Bethany asked me to sleep in her room. She was terrified, clutching her stuffed rabbit like it was a lifeline. "Please, Uncle, I don't want to be alone. It comes out more at night, especially on Christmas." I set up a sleeping bag on her floor, thinking maybe my presence would help her sleep better. We watched some Christmas movies on my laptop, and eventually she dozed off around 10 p.m. I stayed up a bit longer, answering some work emails before turning in myself. I woke up to Bethany shaking my shoulder. The digital clock on her nightstand read 2:17 a.m. "I'm thirsty," she whispered. "Can you get me some water?" Groggy, I sat up and nodded. "Sure, kiddo." "You have to come with me," she said, her voice trembling. "If I get out of bed alone, it'll get me." I sighed but got up. If playing along with her fears helped her feel better, I could do that. She grabbed my hand tight as we walked toward her bedroom door. Her palm was sweaty, and I could feel her whole body shaking. That's when I saw it. Standing in the corner by her dollhouse was something. It wasn't tall, maybe 3 feet high, but it didn't look like any doll or toy I'd ever seen. It had a humanoid shape, wearing what looked like a tattered red and green outfit. But its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down past where its knees should be. Its fingers ended in what looked like actual claws, thin and curved. But its face, God, its face. It had blank white eyes, no pupils, just glassy white orbs that somehow still seemed to be staring right at us. Its mouth was stretched in an impossible grin, filled with teeth that were exactly as Bethany had described. Too many, too long, too thin, like needles crammed into its mouth. I froze. I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. Bethany's grip on my hand tightened. "Do you see it now?" she whispered. "Do you believe me?" I fumbled for my phone in my pocket. I needed to document this, to prove I wasn't hallucinating. As I raised my phone to take a picture, the thing's head snapped toward me, the movement too quick, too jerky to be natural. And then it moved. It didn't run like a person. It scrambled across the floor on all fours, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, moving with impossible speed. It was coming straight at us. Bethany screamed and shoved me hard, pushing me backward through the doorway. Before I could react, the door slammed shut between us. I heard the lock click. "Bethany!" I screamed, yanking on the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. "Bethany!" From inside, I heard screeching, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that formed words. "Merry Creepiness! Merry creepiness interspersed with Bethany's terrified screams. I slammed my shoulder against the door again and again. I called Sarah, but it went straight to voicemail. She was probably with a patient. I called 911, but the dispatcher said all units were responding to a pileup on the highway. It would be at least 30 minutes before anyone could come. Bethany's screams became more desperate. I ran to the garage, found a hammer and screwdriver, and rushed back. I started making a hole in the door, smashing and drilling frantically. Through the small hole I'd made, I could see flashes of movement and hear wet, tearing sounds. And then the screaming stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a ripping sound, like fabric being torn, and then a wet, slurping noise that made me gag. Then the lock on Bethany's door clicked open by itself. I stood there, hammer in hand, terrified of what I'd find. But I had to go in. I had to help Bethany. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The scene before me will haunt me until the day I die. The walls, the bed, the furniture, everything was splattered with blood. And there, in the center of the room, was the elf, hovering a few inches above the floor. Beneath it lay Bethany, or what was left of her. Her body had been split open from throat to pelvis, her rib cage pried apart like someone had opened a book. The elf had her intestines wrapped around its neck like a garland. It was eating them, stuffing them into its mouth with those long clawed fingers. When it saw me, it smiled wider, blood and bits of tissue dripping from its needle teeth. I heard a noise behind me and turned to see Sarah standing in the hallway. She must have come home early. She stared past me into the room, but her face was wrong. There was no horror, no grief, just a blank expression. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just looked at the scene with empty eyes. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the door. We barricaded ourselves in her bedroom, pushing a dresser against the door. I called 911 again, begging them to hurry. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't react when I said her name. It was like she'd completely shut down. We waited for almost an hour before we heard sirens. When the police finally arrived, I led them to Bethany's room, warning them about what they'd find. But when they opened the door, there was nothing. No blood, no elf, no Bethany. Just an empty, ordinary little girl's room. The only thing out of place was the window, which was open, letting in the snow that had begun falling outside. The police searched the house, the yard, the neighborhood. They brought in dogs. They questioned Sarah and me separately for hours. They clearly thought one of us had done something to Bethany. How could I explain what I'd seen? They'd think I was insane. Sarah never spoke a word during the investigation, not one. The doctors said it was severe PTSD and dissociation. She was eventually admitted to a psychiatric facility when she stopped eating or responding to anyone. The official report lists Bethany as missing. The police theory is that she ran away or was abducted through the window. There was no physical evidence of violence in the room. My testimony was dismissed as the ramblings of a distraught, possibly intoxicated uncle. I'd had a beer with dinner, which I admitted. Sarah killed herself in the psychiatric facility 3 months ago, hung herself with bed sheets. I'm the only one left who knows what really happened, the only one who saw that thing. And now Christmas is coming again. I've moved to another state, changed my number, deleted my social media. But it doesn't matter. For the past week, I've been hearing bells at night, tiny, tinkling bells. And sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I swear I hear a voice whispering, "Merry creepiness." Last night, I found small, crescent-shaped bite marks around my ankles. I don't know what this thing is or why it chose Bethany's family. I don't know if anyone will believe me or if anyone can help. but I know I'm not going to live to see New Year's. It's coming for me. It's just waiting for Christmas Eve. If you've seen something like this, if you know what it is or how to stop it, please tell me. And if you haven't, if you have kids who start talking about elves that aren't the ones you put out as decorations, for God's sake, believe them. I'm still shaking as I type this. Even after 3 months, I can't sleep through the night without jolting awake, thinking I hear whispers. My therapist suggested writing about what happened might help, so here goes. It was supposed to be our annual camping trip, something we'd been doing since college, just 6 friends escaping city life for a weekend. Me, Leo, Mike, Sarah, Luke, Jennifer, and Emily. We'd picked Wasatch Cache National Forest in Utah this year. None of us had been there before, but the photos online looked amazing. We left Salt Lake City around noon on Friday. I remember because Mike was late as usual, and Sarah was giving him crap about it. The mood was light, joking, laughing, excited about disconnecting for a few days. We had our usual van packed with gear, coolers full of beer and food, and enough marshmallows to put us all in sugar comas. About 2 hours in, our GPS signal started getting spotty. Mike suggested a secondary road that looked like a shortcut on the paper map we thankfully had. The road wasn't great, all bumps and gravel, but the scenery was incredible. Massive pines everywhere, mountains in the distance, that kind of pristine wilderness that makes you feel small. We crossed this old wooden bridge over a river that looked ancient. I remember thinking it was strange there wasn't any signage, no warnings about weight limits or anything. Just this weathered, creaking bridge that seemed forgotten by time. Looking back, that should have been our first warning. We found a perfect clearing about a mile past the bridge. It was surrounded by thick pine trees on 3 sides, with a small path leading down to what looked like a stream. No other campers around, which was exactly what we wanted. By 4 p.m., we had our tents up, 3 two-person tents arranged in a semicircle around what would be our fire pit. The sun started setting early behind the mountains, and the temperature dropped fast. Luke got a fire going while Jennifer and Emily prepared dinner. Mike and I collected more firewood, and Sarah set up our portable speakers. Everything felt normal, perfect even. As darkness fell completely, we sat around the fire, eating hot dogs and drinking beers. The stars were incredible, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. No light pollution, no distant highway sounds, just us, the crackling fire, and the endless forest. That's when he appeared. 1 minute we were alone, and the next, this elderly man was standing at the edge of our clearing. None of us heard him approach. He just materialized. We all jumped, and Luke almost fell off his camp chair. The man raised his hand in greeting. "Evening, folks," he said. His voice was deep, weathered like old leather. "Saw your fire from a ways off." He looked Native American, probably in his 70s, with long gray hair tied back. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days. Nothing threatening about him, but something in his eyes made my skin prickle. "Name's Taug," he said, pronouncing it like Teog. He declined our offer of food, but accepted a camp chair when Sarah offered it. "This is ancestral land," he told us, staring into the fire. "My people lived here for centuries before any others came." He wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. He explained he still lived nearby, one of the few who stayed when others left. We all listened, fascinated. It was like having our own personal history lesson. But then his tone changed, became more urgent. "You folks planning to stay the night?" he asked. When we confirmed we were staying the weekend, his expression darkened. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. "There are things in these woods," he said quietly. "Things older than my people. Things that hunger." I remember exchanging glances with Mike, both of us thinking the same thing. Great, a ghost story from the local. But nobody laughed or interrupted. "We call it Kalataka, the whispering goat," Taog continued. "A shapeshifter that can take any form but favors those it wants to hunt. It mimics voices, perfect imitations to lure people away." The fire popped loudly, making Emily jump. Taog didn't seem to notice. "My brother disappeared here, 52 years ago now. We were hunting, and I heard him call my name from deep in the trees. But something felt wrong. The voice was his, but hollow. I stayed put. Then I heard my brother's real voice from our camp, asking where I'd gone." Taog's eyes reflected the flames as he spoke. "Whatever called to me wasn't him." "Did you ever see it?" Luke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Taog nodded slowly. "Once, from a distance, it looked like my brother but wrong, moving like something wearing his skin, learning how to use it." He shuddered visibly. "When it realized I could see it, it changed, became something else. Something with black eyes and a face like a goat, but standing on two legs. Too tall, too thin." The forest around us suddenly seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The fire couldn't push them back far enough. "If you hear your friends calling from the woods at night," Taog said, rising to his feet, "make sure they're really beside you first." With that warning, he refused our offers to stay or take anything with him. He simply walked back into the darkness, disappearing between one blink and the next. We tried to laugh it off. Ghost stories around a campfire are tradition, right? We even joked about it, with Mike doing his best spooky voice. "The whispering goat." But the laughter sounded forced, even to me. None of us wanted to sleep in our tents that night. We didn't say it out loud, but we all grabbed our sleeping bags and arranged them around the fire. Safety in numbers, I guess. I dozed off around 1 a.m., listening to the occasional pop of the dying fire. I woke to someone whispering my name. "Leo. Leo. Come here." It sounded exactly like Mike. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around. Everyone was asleep around the now cold fire pit. Mike was in his sleeping bag about 6 feet away. "Leo, I need your help. Just follow my voice." The whisper came from the trees beyond our clearing. It was Mike's voice, the exact tone, the slight Boston accent, but Mike was right there, sleeping. My heart started hammering. I nudged Sarah, who was closest to me. She woke with a start. "Someone's calling my name," I whispered. "It sounds like Mike." She frowned, confused, when suddenly, Sarah, come quick." Her eyes widened. That was Luke's voice calling her, but Luke was asleep on the other side of the fire. We woke everyone up. They all thought we were pranking them until Jennifer heard her name called in Emily's voice. Then Luke heard Mike calling him. We were all accounted for, sitting right there while our voices called from different directions in the darkness. Nobody slept after that. We kept the fire blazing until dawn, jumping at every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves. When sunrise finally came, we were exhausted but relieved. In daylight, the forest seemed normal again. We decided to explore a bit, staying together as a group. About a quarter-mile from camp, we found strange carvings on some of the older trees, symbols that looked ancient. Further on, we discovered what seemed like stone artifacts, partially buried in the soil. evidence that Taog was right about this being ancestral land. As the day progressed, clouds rolled in. By afternoon, a light rain started falling. We huddled under our tarp, playing cards and trying to convince ourselves that last night was just our imaginations running wild after Taog's story. Around 5 p.m., the rain stopped, but a thick fog started forming, creeping between the trees and filling our clearing. It was unlike any fog I'd seen before, almost yellowish, moving in tendrils like it had purpose. "We need more firewood before it gets completely dark," Luke said, looking at our dwindling pile. Mike volunteered to gather some. "I'll just check the edge of the clearing, won't go far," he promised, grabbing a flashlight even though it wasn't fully dark yet. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At 30 minutes, we started calling for him. When Mike finally returned, arms full of branches, something was off. His movements were stiff, mechanical. His eyes didn't quite focus on any of us. "Got lost in the fog," he said, but his voice sounded flat, emotionless. As he arranged the firewood, I noticed his responses to our questions were delayed, like he had to think about how to answer. When Emily asked if he was okay, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. His smile stretched too wide, stayed too long. Sarah whispered to me, "Something's wrong with him." I nodded, feeling cold sweat trickle down my back. We all felt it. This wasn't quite Mike. Or if it was, something had happened to him out there. When Jennifer told a joke we'd all laughed about earlier, Mike's reaction was delayed by several seconds, like he was waiting for a cue. Then he laughed too loud, too long, watching our faces like he was studying how laughter should work. That's when I decided we needed to leave. Immediately. I discreetly told the others to start packing essential items, quietly, without alerting Mike. As we casually gathered our things, I noticed Mike standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, staring into the fog-filled forest. He wasn't blinking, just staring. Then we heard it. "Help! Guys, help me!" Mike's voice, his real voice, panicked and breathless, coming from the trees, the same direction the Mike standing at the edge of our camp was staring towards. The Mike with us slowly turned his head 180 degrees to look at us, his neck making a sickening cracking sound. His face began to change, elongating, features shifting like clay. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. His eyes sank into his skull, becoming black, bottomless pits. Sarah screamed. That broke our paralysis. "Run!" Luke shouted, grabbing Jennifer's hand. We bolted toward the van, leaving most of our gear behind. I glanced back once to see the thing that had been Mike convulsing, its body contorting in impossible ways as it grew taller, thinner, its skin turning gray and leathery. We reached the van and piled in, Emily frantically searching for the keys. That's when we saw Mike, the real Mike, stumbling out of the forest, clothes torn, a gash on his forehead. "Start the car!" I screamed, jumping out to help him. I grabbed Mike and practically threw him into the van as Emily finally got the engine running. Through the rear window I could see something massive moving through the fog toward us, gray, hunched, with a goat-like face and those same soulless black eyes. Emily floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before catching. We tore down the forest road, the headlights barely cutting through the thick fog. In the rearview mirror, I swear I could see that thing loping after us on all fours, moving impossibly fast. Mike was hyperventilating in the back seat. Between gasps, he told us what happened. While gathering firewood, he'd encountered himself, an exact duplicate, standing among the trees. The duplicate had tried speaking to him in all our voices, telling him to follow. When Mike refused, it attacked him. He escaped by jumping into a stream and following it until he saw our van's headlights. We reached the old bridge, the van's suspension groaning as we sped across. Something slammed into the back of the vehicle just as we cleared the bridge, a massive impact that shattered the rear window. In the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of that thing standing at the edge of the bridge, unwilling or unable to cross. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main highway. Nobody spoke much on the drive back to Salt Lake City. What could we even say? That was 3 months ago. Our group has drifted apart since then. Trauma does that, I guess. Emily and Jennifer moved to Oregon. Luke rarely answers texts. Sarah and Mike still live in Salt Lake, but they've both changed jobs, trying to restart their lives. Me? I live alone now. My girlfriend couldn't handle my night terrors, the way I'd wake up screaming, convinced something was watching me from the corner of the room. The worst part is the whispers. They never stopped. At night, I hear my name called in the voices of people I love. Sometimes from outside my window, sometimes from inside my closet. Last week, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to find my bedroom door open. I always close it before sleeping. As I stared into the darkness of my hallway, I saw a shadowy figure standing there, just standing, watching. Its eyes reflected the dim light from my window, black, soulless pools. It spoke in all my friends' voices at once. "We missed you, Leo. I'm at my parents' house now. I don't know how long I can keep running. I don't know if it followed me from Utah or if it was always here, waiting for someone to recognize it. If you're ever in the woods and hear a familiar voice calling you from somewhere you can't see, don't answer, don't follow. Make sure the person you think is calling is really beside you, because some things can wear the voices we trust like we wear clothes, and they're hungry." I've been putting this off for too long. Writing it down might help me process what happened, or at least stop the nightmares. I'm not looking for advice or solutions. There aren't any. I just need someone to believe me. 3 days ago, I returned to my childhood home after 32 years. I'm a doctor now, a neurologist, which seems almost funny given how much I've tried to convince myself that what I experienced as a child was just my imagination or some kind of stress response. Medical school taught me all the rational explanations for supernatural experiences, sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, false memories. I've clung to those explanations like a life raft, but I knew they weren't true. I always knew. The drive to Halley Farm took almost 6 hours from my practice in Chicago. With each mile, I felt physically ill, sweating, heart racing, hands shaking on the steering wheel. Twice I had to pull over because I thought I was going to throw up. My therapist would call this an acute anxiety response. She doesn't know what's waiting in that cornfield. The farm looked smaller than I remembered. The 2-story farmhouse was still standing, but barely. Roof partially collapsed, windows broken, siding gray and peeling. The barn had completely fallen in on itself, but the cornfield, that damn cornfield, it was still there. Wild and overgrown, but corn was still growing, even though no one had tended this land since 1987. That cornfield was always special. Only about 3 acres, tiny compared to the industrial farms that surrounded us even back then. But it produced more corn than farms, 5 times its size. My father never used pesticides or commercial fertilizers. He had his own methods, he'd say, with that tight smile that never reached his eyes. Those methods included 4 scarecrows placed in a perfect diamond pattern around the field. Not normal scarecrows. These were over 8 feet tall, with bodies made from twisted branches bound with twine, dressed in my father's old clothes. Their heads were burlap sacks stuffed with straw, featureless except for small holes where eyes should be. Dad made a big production of placing them each spring and taking them down after harvest. Then there were the pylons, 10 wooden stakes about 4 feet tall with strange symbols carved into them. Every afternoon, like clockwork, Dad would hammer them into the ground in a circle around our house. At dawn, he'd pull them up again. When I asked why, he just said, "Insurance, Timmy. Everybody needs insurance." The most important rule in our house, I had to be inside before sunset. No exceptions. As a kid, I didn't question it much. That's just how it was at our house, like how some kids had to take off their shoes inside or say grace before dinner. Until that summer evening when I was 9. I was playing football by myself, practicing kicks in the side yard. Dad was in the barn, Mom was cooking dinner. I knew it was getting late, but the sky was so beautiful, all pink and orange, and I wanted to make just one more perfect kick, then one more after that, and another. I didn't hear Dad coming until he grabbed my arm. His face was red, veins bulging in his forehead. "What did I tell you?" he shouted, fingers digging into my skin. "What did I tell you?" He dragged me inside, past my mother, who stood silently in the kitchen doorway, and sent me to bed without dinner. I cried myself to sleep, thinking he was so unfair, so mean. I didn't understand his fear then. I woke up around midnight, thirsty and still angry. As I passed the window on the way to get water, I noticed my football sitting in the yard where I'd left it. In my 9-year-old mind, this seemed like an emergency. What if it rained overnight? What if Dad ran over it with the tractor? The house was silent. My parents' bedroom door was closed. I crept downstairs, careful to skip the 3rd step that always creaked, and slipped outside. The moon was nearly full, lighting the yard enough that I could see my ball about 20 yards away. I was halfway to it when I noticed the movement in the cornfield. The scarecrows weren't in their places anymore. They were in the center of the field, their tall forms visible above the cornstalks. And they were moving. Not blowing in the wind, but moving with purpose, their straw bodies bending and twisting as if they were wrestling with something or someone on the ground. I stood frozen, unable to breathe. One of them straightened up suddenly and turned in my direction. It had no face, no eyes, but I felt it see me. I felt its hatred, its hunger, radiating across the yard like a physical force. Then the others turned too, all of them staring at me with their blank, terrible faces. They started moving toward the edge of the field, toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then strong hands grabbed me from behind, and I almost passed out from terror until I realized it was my father. He scooped me up and ran back to the house, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Inside, he slammed the door and locked it, leaning against it. I expected him to be angry, but he just looked scared. Terrified, actually. "Did they see you?" he whispered. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "Damn it," he muttered, then looked me straight in the eyes. "Listen to me, Timothy. You never go out after dark. Never. Do you understand me now? Do you see why?" I nodded again, too frightened to speak. Dad checked every window and door, then placed a line of salt across each threshold and windowsill. He stayed awake all night, sitting in the living room with his shotgun across his lap, though we both knew bullets wouldn't stop what was out there. The next morning, the scarecrows were back in their places. Dad didn't mention what happened, and neither did I. But things changed after that night. Dad tripled the symbols on the pylons. Mom became quieter, jumpier. I'd catch her staring out at the cornfield with red-rimmed eyes. 3 weeks later, I woke to my father shaking me roughly. "Get up," he hissed. "We need to go, now." "Where's Mom?" I asked, still half asleep. "Just get your shoes on," he said, throwing clothes at me. The clock said 3:17 a.m. Dad had a small bag packed. He was breathing hard, sweating despite the cool night. He practically carried me to his pickup truck, looking back at the house every few seconds. As we drove away, I looked out the back window. The scarecrows were moving again, gathered at the center of the field, and there was a sound. God, I've tried so hard to forget that sound. High-pitched screams, muffled like they were coming from underground. "Dad, Mom's still—" "I'm sorry," he kept saying over and over. "I thought I did everything right. I'm so sorry, Timmy." We never went back. We never talked about what happened. We never talked about Mom. We moved to my aunt's house in Wisconsin, and Dad became a shadow of himself, drinking too much and dying of liver failure before I finished high school. For 3 decades, I've tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that my mother left us, or there was an accident I was too young to understand, that scarecrows don't move, that the ground doesn't scream. But 3 days ago I went back with a shovel. I knew exactly where to dig, where the scarecrows had gathered that night. The soil was unusually dark and rich. It didn't take long to find the first bone. By sunset, I had uncovered dozens of human remains, skulls, femurs, rib cages, buried at different depths. Some seemed decades old, others more recent. Too many to count, each one carefully placed, deliberately buried. Among them, a small silver necklace with a butterfly pendant, my mother's. The farm's incredible fertility wasn't a miracle. It was fed with blood and bone and lives. The scarecrows weren't guardians. They were harvesters. I finally understood my father's rituals. The pylons, the salt, the strict rules. He was trying to protect us from whatever ancient hunger lived in that soil, something his family had been appeasing for generations, something he thought he could contain with his symbols and sacrifices of animals. Until that night, I broke the rules. They saw me. They wanted me. And my father. God, my father couldn't give them his son, so he gave them— I was still digging, tears blinding me, when I noticed the sun had set. I hadn't brought a flashlight, hadn't planned to stay so long. When I looked up, all 4 scarecrows were at the edges of their diamond pattern, facing inward, facing me. I ran, left the shovel, left my mother's necklace, left everything and drove away as fast as I could. I should have burned that place to the ground, should have called the police, should have done something. But terror makes cowards of us all. Last night, I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. When I looked, there was nothing there, just the branch of a tree moving in the wind. But it wasn't windy last night, and when I got up this morning, there was a perfect line of dirt across my doorway, dark and rich, like someone had carefully placed it there. I swept it away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the broom. Tonight I'm staying at a hotel. Tomorrow I'll go somewhere else. But I know it doesn't matter. They found me once. They'll find me again. I understand now why my father ran and kept running, why he drank himself to death. There are some things you can't escape no matter how far you go. Some hungers never end. I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be rational, scientific. But I know what I saw. I know what I dug up. And I know they're coming for me. Because I broke the rules again. I went back. I disturbed their harvest ground. And this time, there's no one to sacrifice in my place. I still don't know what I saw that night in Oregon. It's been almost 3 months, and I haven't told anyone except my therapist, who probably thinks I was hallucinating from grief or something. But I know what I saw was real. I can still see it when I close my eyes. After my dad killed himself last November, I found out he'd left me his cabin in the Cascade Mountains. It was this small A-frame place about 40 minutes outside of Bend, Oregon. Pretty isolated, surrounded by forest, the kind of place where cell service is practically non-existent. My dad bought it when I was a kid, and we used to spend summers and some winter breaks there. But after my parents divorced, those trips became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. I hadn't been there in maybe 7 years. The lawyer handling my dad's estate said they were planning to sell it as part of settling his affairs, but I could use it one last time if I wanted. I don't know why, but something pulled me to go there. Maybe to say goodbye to the place, or to feel close to my dad again. I was still trying to process everything. So in early January, I packed up my Subaru, grabbed my dog Midnight, he's a black lab mix, and drove the 8 hours from Seattle to the cabin. The roads were clear enough despite it being winter, though there was plenty of snow on the ground when I got there. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, just a modest 2-bedroom place with a loft, a small kitchen, and a living room with a wood stove. But it was in good shape. Dad had obviously maintained it well. The first couple days were actually really peaceful. I spent my time snowboarding at Mount Bachelor, playing video games on the old TV my dad had hooked up, and just sitting by the fire with Midnight. I'd brought enough food and beer to last the week I planned to stay. The isolation felt good, like I could finally breathe after months of suffocating grief and paperwork and people asking how I was doing with that sad look in their eyes. Everything changed on the 3rd day. I woke up late, around 10 a.m. After making coffee, I let Midnight out to do his business. That's when I noticed the footprints in the snow around the cabin. They circled the entire building, like someone had walked around it multiple times during the night. That was weird because the nearest occupied cabin was at least a mile away, and these weren't hiking boot prints. They were barefoot, fucking barefoot in the snow. And they were huge, way bigger than my size 11 boots. I figured maybe some drunk hiker had gotten lost, though that didn't explain why they'd be barefoot in January in Oregon. I checked to make sure nothing was missing or damaged on the property, but everything seemed fine. Still, it creeped me out a little. As the day went on, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I spent a few hours chopping firewood and clearing some snow from the walkway. The sky had that heavy gray look that promised more snow coming. Around 4 p.m. it started getting dark, one of those early winter sunsets. I made dinner, fed Midnight, and settled in to watch a movie. That's when Midnight started acting weird. He kept getting up, walking to the front door, and whining. His ears were perked up, and he seemed agitated. I figured he needed to pee again, so I opened the door and followed him out onto the front porch. Instead of going to his usual spot, he just stood there, staring into the darkness of the forest. His body was rigid, and the hair on his back was standing up. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but he just kept staring. I couldn't see anything out there, just darkness and the shapes of pine trees covered in snow. After a minute or two, I got cold and called him back inside. He reluctantly followed me, but kept looking back at the door. Throughout the evening, Midnight remained on edge. He'd settle down for a bit, then suddenly jump up and stare at the windows or the door. I tried to concentrate on my movie, but his behavior was making me nervous. Around 11 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I locked all the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered doing the previous nights. turned off all the lights except a small lamp in the hallway, and went to bed. Midnight jumped up and lay at my feet, which was normal. I dozed off pretty quickly, but woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional crack from the dying fire in the wood stove. Then I heard it, footsteps on the roof. It sounded like someone was walking directly above my bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps. Thump, pause, thump, pause. My first thought was that it might be a raccoon or maybe a bear, though I'd never heard of bears climbing on roofs. Midnight was already awake, standing on the bed, growling low in his throat. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. Probably just an animal. The footsteps continued, moving from above my bedroom toward the front of the cabin. I got up, grabbed the baseball bat I'd brought from the closet, a habit from living in the city, and walked into the main room. Midnight followed close behind me, still growling. The footsteps were clearer now, definitely too heavy for a raccoon. The cabin had a small balcony off the living room that wrapped around one side of the building. I figured I could step out there and maybe see what was on the roof. I unlocked the sliding glass door, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. Midnight tried to follow me, but I made him stay inside. It was freezing out, and I was just wearing sweats and a t-shirt, but the adrenaline kept me from feeling the cold. I looked up at the roof, but couldn't see anything unusual on it. No animal, no person. The footsteps had stopped. I was about to go back inside when something caught my eye. Movement in one of the tall pine trees about 30 feet from the cabin. At first, I thought it was just a branch moving in the wind, but there was no wind that night. Everything was completely still. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and that's when my entire body went cold. There, crouching between the branches, was something. It was tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with gray skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its arms were impossibly long, extended above its head like it was reaching for the top of the tree. But the worst part was its face. It was looking right at me, mouth open in this grotesque grin that stretched way too wide, showing rows of small, pointed teeth. Its eyes reflected the dim light from inside the cabin, 2 pinpricks of yellowish light in the darkness. I stood there frozen, unable to move or even breathe. The thing didn't move either. It just stared at me, that horrible grin fixed on its face. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably just seconds, but it felt like hours. Then Midnight started barking frantically inside, and the spell broke. I rushed back in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the lock. Midnight was going crazy, barking at the glass door like he wanted to tear through it. I grabbed him by the collar and pulled him away, closing the curtains over the door. "Did you see it?" I whispered to him, my voice cracking. "Tell me you saw it too." I checked all the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked. Then I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. The cabin had a landline, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone, just dead silence. I sat on the couch with the baseball bat across my knees, Midnight pressed against my side, both of us staring at the curtained sliding door. I kept trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that grief and isolation were making me see things. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap on the screen door at the front of the cabin. Soft at first, then more insistent. Tap, 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 like something wanted me to let it in. Midnight started growling again, his eyes fixed on the front door. Then I heard a voice, not outside, but in my head. It sounded like my dad. "Stay in bed, Danny. No matter what you hear, stay in bed." That's what he used to tell me when I was a kid and got scared by noises at night. But my dad was dead, and I wasn't in bed. I was sitting on the couch, terrified out of my mind. The tapping continued all night, sometimes stopping for 15 or 20 minutes, then starting again. I didn't dare look outside. I kept the lights off and just sat there, clutching the bat, midnight alert beside me. At some point, I must have dozed off despite my fear, because suddenly light was streaming through the cracks in the curtains, and the tapping had stopped. Morning had never felt so welcome. I cautiously peeked through the curtains. The forest looked normal in the daylight, just trees and snow, no sign of the thing I'd seen. But when I checked the front door, there were deep scratches in the wooden frame around the screen door, like something had been trying to claw its way in. I packed my stuff in record time, not even bothering with breakfast. Midnight seemed as eager to leave as I was. As I was throwing my bags in the car, I noticed new footprints in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight. The same huge barefoot prints circling the cabin. And worse, at the base of the pine tree where I'd seen the thing, there was a disturbance in the snow, like something heavy had jumped down from it. I got in my car, midnight in the passenger seat, and drove away as fast as I safely could on the snowy roads. I didn't look back at the cabin, and I didn't stop until I reached Bend and found a gas station with people around. I never went back to the cabin. I called the lawyer from Bend and told him to go ahead with the sale. I didn't tell him why. I drove straight back to Seattle and haven't left the city since. Sometimes at night, I still hear that tapping sound, like something's at my window, wanting to be let in. Midnight still gets up sometimes and stares at the door, growling low in his throat. And sometimes I swear I can hear my dad's voice telling me to stay in bed. I don't know what that thing was. I've tried researching local legends about the Oregon forests, but nothing quite matches what I saw. All I know is that my father killed himself in that cabin, and something was there with me that night. Something that knew my name and could mimic my father's voice. Something that wanted me to open the door. I'm still not sure why I'm sharing this. Maybe I just need someone to believe me. Maybe I need to convince myself that what I saw was real. Or maybe I'm hoping someone else has seen it too and can tell me what it was. All I know for sure is that I'm never going back to those woods again. I've been putting off writing about this for years. I've told a few friends, but I always feel stupid afterward because I can never fully explain how terrifying it was. There's no physical evidence. Nothing happened to me physically. I just encountered something I can't explain, and it broke a part of me that I haven't been able to fix. For background, I moved to Philadelphia in 2018 for a marketing job. I shared an apartment with my buddy from college, Sean, who's always been an early-to-bed type. He'd usually be asleep by 10:30, while I've always been a night owl. Back then, I had this habit of going for walks late at night. It started innocently. I couldn't sleep one night and decided to walk around the block. The quiet streets, the empty sidewalks, that specific kind of urban silence you only get at 2 a.m. on a weeknight. I loved it. It became my thing. After Sean went to bed, I'd grab my headphones, put on a podcast, and just walk for an hour or so. I never felt scared during these walks. Not once. I'm a 6'2" guy, fairly athletic, and I kept to well-lit areas. I'd see other night walkers sometimes, insomniacs, shift workers, the occasional drunk straggler, and we'd do that urban acknowledgement thing where you give a slight nod without making eye contact. I did this for almost 4 years without incident, until that Wednesday night last October. It was probably around 1:30 a.m. when I left the apartment. The air had that perfect fall crispness, cold enough for a light jacket but not uncomfortable. I had my usual setup: phone, headphones, keys. I was listening to some true crime podcast, ironically enough. My route that night took me toward Porter Street, which runs along Fleming Park. Nothing fancy, just a small urban park with some benches and trees. The streetlights were functioning normally. It was just another night. I was about halfway down Porter when I noticed something at the far end of the street, maybe 100 yards ahead. At first, it was just a silhouette, backlit by the streetlight behind it. A person, tall and thin, moving in an unusual way. The movement caught my attention immediately because it wasn't normal walking. It was almost like dancing. The figure was gliding side to side while moving forward, arms slightly extended in this bizarre, fluid motion. Like someone performing an exaggerated tiptoe or doing some kind of street performance without music. I remember thinking it was probably just some drunk guy, but something about it made me pause my podcast. I didn't feel threatened yet, just curious. The figure was moving directly toward me down the sidewalk. As the distance closed between us and the person entered the light from another street lamp, I could make out details that turned curiosity into unease. It was a man in what looked like a dark business suit, taller than me, and extremely thin. His body proportions seemed slightly off somehow, but it was his face that made my stomach drop. His head was tilted back slightly, like he was looking at the stars or the tops of buildings, but his eyes were wide open and clearly visible. And his mouth, his mouth was stretched into this massive, unnatural smile. Not a normal happy smile or even a drunk guy's sloppy grin. It was like someone had drawn a cartoon smile on a real person. It stretched ear to ear, showing all his teeth, and never faltered as he continued his bizarre dance walk toward me. My first instinct was to avoid whatever the hell this was. I casually crossed to the other side of the street, trying not to look directly at him while keeping him in my peripheral vision. I figured maybe he was on something, having some kind of episode, or just being weird for the sake of being weird. After I crossed, I glanced back and saw that he had stopped moving completely. He was perfectly still now, standing ramrod straight, head still tilted back, smile still plastered on his face. But here's the part that made my skin crawl. He was standing exactly parallel to me on the opposite sidewalk, like he had calculated the precise spot to stop that would put him directly across from me. I picked up my pace slightly, but tried to act normal. I'd encountered plenty of people on drugs or with mental health issues during my night walks, and I knew the best approach was to just keep moving without engaging. I walked about 20 more yards, then looked back quickly to see if he was following. He was gone. I stopped walking. The street was empty where he had been standing. Relief washed over me for about 3 seconds, until I turned my head back forward and nearly jumped out of my skin. The smiling man was now on my side of the street, maybe 30 feet ahead of me. He was crouched down in a position that looked painful, almost like a baseball catcher, but with his knees spread wider, his suit jacket hanging loosely. His head was still tilted back, and that terrible smile was aimed directly at me now. I froze. My heart felt like it was trying to punch through my chest. How had he moved so quickly and silently? I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen him cross. It was as if he had teleported. As I stood there, he slowly began to rise from his crouch, unfolding his long limbs in a fluid motion that seemed too smooth to be natural. Then he started approaching me again, using that same exaggerated tiptoe step, but faster now, much faster. His arms were swinging in deliberate pendulum-like arcs at his sides. I managed to choke out, What do you want? My voice sounded pathetic even to my own ears. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken at all. Just kept coming with that relentless smile and those wide, unblinking eyes fixed somewhere above my head. When he was about 15 feet away, he suddenly stopped. He held that position for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, as abruptly as he had appeared, he turned around and started dance-walking in the opposite direction. The relief I felt was overwhelming. My legs were shaking so badly I had to lean against a parked car. I watched as he continued his strange movements away from me, getting smaller in the distance. I should have run then. I should have turned and sprinted in the opposite direction. But I stood there like an idiot, watching him go, thinking the encounter was over. Then he stopped again. He stood motionless for a moment, back still to me, before slowly rotating his upper body around 180 degrees to face me again, while his legs remained pointing in the original direction. The movement was so unnatural it made my stomach turn. And that smile, still there, still wide and maniacal. Then he started running toward me, not dance-walking, not tiptoeing, full-on sprinting. His arms weren't pumping like a normal runner's would be. They were still swinging in those measured arcs at his sides. His head remained tilted back, eyes wide, smile unwavering. I fucking ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran down Porter Street toward Market, where I knew there would be more people, more light, maybe even a late-night bus or taxi. My lungs were burning by the time I reached the busier street. I finally risked a glance behind me. Nothing. No sign of the smiling man. I bent over, hands on knees, trying to catch my breath while scanning the sidewalk in both directions. The street was empty except for a few cars passing by. I was too scared to walk home alone, so I called an Uber even though my apartment was only about a mile away. I waited under the bright lights of a convenience store, jumping at every shadow until the car arrived. The driver asked if I was okay. I must have looked like hell, sweating, pale, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I mumbled something about thinking someone was following me. He nodded sympathetically and drove extra slowly past my apartment building so I could check if anyone was lurking outside before I got out. I took the stairs 2 at a time, locked the door behind me, and checked every closet and under every bed before I could even begin to calm down. Sean slept through the whole thing. The next day, I tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just some guy on drugs. Maybe he was mentally ill. Maybe he was a performance artist pulling some weird stunt. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit what I saw. The way he moved didn't look like someone on drugs or having a psychotic episode. It looked deliberate, calculated. And his face is what I can't shake from my memory. It wasn't the expression of someone drunk or high. It was the face of someone completely, terrifyingly insane. Not the Hollywood version of insanity, but something much more fundamental and wrong. Like whatever was behind those eyes wasn't fully human. I lived in that apartment for another 6 months before moving back to Ohio for a different job. In that time, I never went for another night walk, not once. I barely went out after dark at all. I'd make excuses to Sean about being tired or having work to do, but really, I was terrified of seeing that man again. I've tried researching similar encounters online. There are a few stories about a smiling man in other cities that sound eerily similar to what I experienced. I don't know if it's the same person traveling around, multiple people doing the same act, or just an urban legend that happened to match what I saw. None of those options make me feel any better. It's been a year, and I still have nightmares about him. I still check the street outside my window before I go to bed. I still can't walk alone at night without feeling like he might be somewhere behind me, silently crossing the street, getting ready to crouch down and smile when I turn around. I know how this sounds. I know most people will think I'm exaggerating, or that I saw something ordinary and my mind twisted it into something sinister. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder, what if he wasn't trying to scare me? What if he was trying to communicate something? What if he's still out there, dance-walking through empty streets, waiting for me to come back? I don't have any profound conclusion or explanation for what happened that night. I just know that I saw something that shouldn't exist in a rational world. And knowing that such things can exist, can be encountered on an ordinary Wednesday night on an ordinary street, that's changed something fundamental in how I see the world. I don't walk at night anymore, not ever, not alone. I still can't believe I'm writing this down. Maybe it will help me process what happened. It's been 2 months since that night in the Sierra Madre El Occidentate, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like it's trying to escape my chest. I've been a real estate agent for almost 12 years now. I specialize in high-end properties around Mexico City, but occasionally I take on listings in more remote areas. The commission on these luxury homes makes the extra work worth it. At least, that's what I used to think. The property in question was a modern cabin, more like a mansion really, nestled deep in the Sierra Madre El Occidentate mountains. It had been in our company's portfolio for nearly 3 years. The owner, a famous regional singer who'd made it big with a few international hits, had originally purchased it as a getaway spot, but barely used it. He finally decided to sell after his career took him permanently to the U.S. My boss called me into his office one Monday morning. "Carlos, I need someone to handle the Sidentate property. Mariana's on maternity leave, and you're the only one with experience in remote listings." I'd heard about this place from office gossip. Beautiful but impossible to show to clients because of its location. The roads to get there were confusing, often disappearing into forest paths that looked identical. GPS was unreliable in the area due to the mountains, but the property itself was stunning. 5,000 square feet of luxury with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a valley that seemed untouched by civilization. "I'll take it," I said, already calculating the commission. A property that size, even in a remote location, would easily net me enough to put a down payment on my own place. The following week, I drove out with Miguel, an older agent who'd been to the property once before for the initial listing photos. The drive took nearly 4 hours from Mexico City, the last hour on roads that grew increasingly narrow and poorly maintained. "I don't like this place," Miguel said as we turned onto what barely qualified as a road. "The locals in the nearest village don't come up here. They say the forest confuses people on purpose." I laughed. "Sounds like a story they tell tourists." Miguel didn't smile. "Just don't stay overnight, Carlos, whatever you do." I brushed off his warning. Miguel was superstitious, the type who wouldn't walk under ladders and crossed himself whenever a black cat crossed his path. The cabin itself was even more impressive than the photos suggested. Perched on a ridge with glass walls facing the valley, it looked like something from an architectural magazine. Inside, the furniture was covered with sheets, a thin layer of dust coating every surface. "The owner wants to refresh it before showing," Miguel explained. "New paint, fix some water damage in the guest bathroom, general maintenance. The nearest village has some workers who can do it, but someone needs to supervise." "I'll handle it," I said, already picturing myself staying there. The place was silent in a way I'd never experienced. No traffic noise, no neighbors, not even many birds. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. "Remember what I said?" Miguel warned as we left. "Don't stay overnight." I nodded, though I had no intention of following his advice. The commission on this place would be substantial, and I wanted to ensure the work was done properly. Besides, who wouldn't want to spend a night in a luxury cabin? 2 days later, I returned with a team of 3 workers from the village about 40 minutes down the mountain. They were quiet men who kept to themselves, speaking to each other in hushed tones in what sounded like a local dialect. "We finish before dark," the oldest one told me firmly. "No one stays on this mountain after sunset." I smiled politely but didn't respond. Their superstitions weren't my concern. They worked efficiently, patching the water damage, touching up paint, and fixing a few loose floorboards. By 4:30 p.m., they were packing up their tools. "You come with us," the old worker said. It wasn't a question. "I'm staying to finish some things," I replied. "The owner wants photos of the completed work, and the lighting will be better in the morning." The 3 men exchanged glances. The oldest pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden cross on a leather cord. "Take this," he said, pressing it into my palm. "Keep it with you." I thanked him to be polite, tucking it into my jeans pocket. As their truck disappeared down the winding road, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The silence seemed deeper now that I was alone. I spent the next couple of hours taking inventory of what still needed work. The property had good bones, but 3 years of minimal upkeep had taken its toll. I made notes about replacing some weather stripping around the windows and getting the water heater serviced. As the sun began to set, I made myself dinner from the supplies I'd brought. The kitchen was high-end, Viking range, marble countertops, the works. I ate at the island counter, looking out at the darkening forest through the wall of windows. That's when I first noticed something off. Among the trees, maybe 50 yards from the house, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a face, a woman's face, pale and still. I stood up, squinting to see better, but whatever it was had disappeared. Probably just shadows playing tricks on me, I thought. The forest was dense, and the fading light created strange patterns. I finished my dinner and decided to try calling my boss to update him on the progress. No signal. I'd been warned about this, but it was still frustrating. I'd have to drive partway down the mountain to find service. Just as I was considering whether to do that now or in the morning, I heard it. Laughter. Not joyful laughter, but a high-pitched, almost childlike giggle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. I was alone on a mountain. There shouldn't be anyone else around for miles. The laughter didn't repeat. I convinced myself it was just the wind or some animal I wasn't familiar with. Mountain areas had all sorts of wildlife. By 9 p.m., the darkness outside was absolute. No street lights, no neighboring houses, just an inky void beyond the windows. I drew the curtains across the glass wall and turned on every light in the main living area. The electric generator hummed steadily outside, providing power to the isolated property. I decided to try for a cell signal. Grabbing my jacket and phone, I stepped outside onto the wide deck that wrapped around the cabin. The night air was chilly and unnaturally still. No wind, no insect sounds, nothing, just silence. I walked to my car, parked about 30 feet from the house, and drove about a quarter-mile up a service road that led to a slightly higher elevation. As I'd hoped, 1 bar of signal appeared on my phone. I quickly called my boss, leaving a voicemail about the progress and some questions about additional repairs. When I returned to the cabin 20 minutes later, I immediately knew something was wrong. The front door was open, not just unlocked, but standing wide open. I was certain I'd closed it when I left, and the lights, I'd left them all on. But now the cabin was dark except for a single lamp in the living room. I sat in my car, engine still running, heart racing. Maybe there was a power surge that tripped the breaker, but that wouldn't explain the open door. I considered driving back down to the village, but the thought of navigating those treacherous mountain roads in the dark was equally terrifying. I was stuck. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and approached the cabin cautiously. The door swung gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I stepped inside, sweeping my flashlight across the entryway. Nothing seemed disturbed. I moved toward the breaker panel in the utility room, flinching at every shadow. The main breaker had indeed been tripped. I flipped it back on and lights flooded the space. The sudden brightness was almost as startling as the darkness had been. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the hardwood floor upstairs. Not the random creaks of a settling house, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I bolted back outside, not even bothering to close the door behind me. In my panic, I tripped on the porch steps and dropped my car keys. As I scrambled to find them in the dark, the footsteps continued inside, now moving toward the stairs. I abandoned the keys and ran, not to my car, but around the side of the cabin, where a small crawl space accessed the area beneath the structure. It was the only hiding place I could think of. I squeezed through the narrow opening and pressed myself against the cool dirt, trying to control my breathing. From underneath the floorboards, I could hear movement in the cabin. Not just footsteps now, but something being dragged across the floor. It continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then silence again. I stayed hidden, afraid to move. The night air grew colder, and I hugged myself for warmth, regretting my decision to leave my jacket in the car. That's when I remembered the wooden cross the worker had given me. I pulled it from my pocket, clutching it tightly, feeling slightly ridiculous but also desperate for any form of protection. Then my car alarm went off, the shrill sound cutting through the silence like a knife. I jerked in surprise, hitting my head on one of the floor joists above me. Through a gap in the lattice covering the crawl space, I could see the driveway and my car, lights flashing with the alarm. And there, moving quickly toward the tree line, was a figure. In the intermittent flashes from my car's headlights, I could make out what looked like a woman in a long tunic or dress. But something was wrong with the way she moved. Her legs, they bent backward, like a dog's or goat's hind legs. She disappeared into the trees just as the alarm stopped, plunging everything back into darkness. I stayed under that cabin all night, shivering and terrified, the wooden cross clutched so tightly in my hand that it left an imprint on my palm. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the lattice, and I could hear voices, normal, human voices, approaching the cabin. The workers had returned, as scheduled, to finish the repairs. I crawled out from my hiding place, covered in dirt, and probably looking like a madman. The workers didn't seem surprised by my appearance or my story. "La mujer del bosque," the oldest worker said, nodding solemnly. "The woman of the forest. She walks these mountains looking for something she lost long ago." "What did she lose?" I asked, still shaking. He shrugged. "Her soul, perhaps, or someone else's." I wanted to leave immediately, but I had responsibilities. The workers continued their repairs while I tried to gather my composure. I found my keys in the grass where I'd dropped them. Inside the cabin, nothing seemed out of place except for one thing. All the sheet covers had been removed from the furniture and were now piled neatly in the center of the living room. Around noon, potential buyers arrived, a couple from Texas who'd heard about the property through a friend of the singer. I hadn't scheduled this showing, but they insisted my office had arranged it. I was in no state to argue, so I showed them around, trying to appear professional despite my disheveled appearance. They seemed less interested in the cabin itself than in the surrounding forest. The husband kept asking about trails and whether any special sites were located nearby. I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't want to know. They left after an hour, the wife whispering something to her husband that made him frown deeply. By 3 p.m., I'd made up my mind to leave, repairs finished or not. That's when my phone rang, the first signal I'd had all day. It was Andres, a newer agent from our office who was helping me with some paperwork for the listing. "Carlos, I lost my medallion somewhere yesterday," he said, sounding worried. "My Virgin Mary, the one my grandmother gave me. I think it might have fallen off when we were at the cabin. I'm driving up now to look for it." "No," I shouted into the phone. "Don't come up here. I'll look for it." But the call dropped before he could respond. I tried calling back, but the signal was gone again. I told the workers I needed to find something before we left. They exchanged glances but continued packing up their tools. I searched the main areas of the cabin where Andres and I had walked during our brief visit the previous day, but found nothing. By 4 p.m., the workers were insistent about leaving. I heard a car approaching. Andres, I assumed. Sure enough, his beat-up Honda pulled up beside my SUV. "Did you find it?" he asked as he got out looking hopeful. I shook my head. "We need to go, Andres, now." But he was already walking toward the cabin. "It'll just take a minute. It has to be here somewhere." The workers were pulling away in their truck, the oldest one giving me a look that clearly said, "Your funeral." I hurried after Andres, determined not to let him stay as night approached. We searched the cabin again without success. Andres suggested checking outside, where we'd walked around the property during our previous visit. "The sun will be setting soon," I warned. "We need to leave." "Just a quick look," he insisted. "That medallion means everything to me." We split up to cover more ground, me taking the front yard, while Andres went around back toward a small garden area. That was my mistake, letting us separate. I heard him call out about 10 minutes later. "Carlos, I think I see it in the trees." I ran around the cabin to find Andres standing at the edge of the forest, pointing into the dense underbrush. "There's something shiny in there," he said. Before I could stop him, he stepped into the trees. I followed reluctantly, fear clawing at my insides. The forest seemed to close around us immediately, the cabin vanishing from sight, though we'd only gone a few yards. "There," Andres said, bending to pick something up from the ground. He held up his medallion triumphantly. "Let's go back now." But when we turned around, the way back wasn't clear anymore. Trees surrounded us on all sides, identical and disorienting. The fading daylight barely penetrated the thick canopy above. "This way," I said, trying to sound confident as I pointed in what I thought was the direction of the cabin. We walked for what should have been more than enough time to reach the property, but there was no sign of it. Just more trees, more underbrush, and a growing sense that we were being watched. "Carlos," Andres whispered, grabbing my arm. "Look." About 50 feet ahead stood a woman in a white tunic, her back to us. Her hair was long and black, hanging down to her waist. She stood perfectly still, like a statue among the trees. "Hello?" Andres called out. "Can you help us? We're lost." The woman didn't respond or move. Don't, I hissed, pulling Andres back. That's not someone who can help us. As if hearing my words, the woman's head began to turn. Not her body, just her head, rotating slowly until it faced us, while her body remained facing away. Her face was gaunt, eyes black pits in ashen skin. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous, too sharp. Andres screamed. I yanked him backward and we ran, crashing through the underbrush with no direction in mind except away from her. Behind us, that high-pitched laughter echoed through the trees. We ran until our lungs burned, finally stumbling into a small clearing, and that's when I realized we'd made a terrible mistake. The clearing wasn't empty. Standing in a perfect circle around its edge were figures, at least 12 of them, facing inward. They wore different clothing, some modern, some that looked centuries old, but all stood perfectly still, their faces hidden in shadow. In the center of the circle was a depression in the ground, like a shallow pit. Something about it made my skin crawl. It seemed darker than it should be, as if the twilight couldn't touch it. El Portal, Andres whispered, his voice breaking. The door to hell. My grandmother told me about places like this. One of the figures in the circle slowly raised an arm, pointing at us. Then another did the same. And another. Run! I shouted, pulling Andres toward the only gap in the circle of figures. As we ran, I heard movement behind us, not footsteps, but something moving through the trees alongside us. Branches snapped and leaves rustled, always just out of sight. Miraculously, we stumbled onto a dirt road. In the distance, headlights approached. I frantically waved my arms, and the vehicle, a paramedic truck from the village, screeched to a halt beside us. Get in, the driver shouted. We didn't need to be told twice. As the truck sped away, I glanced out the back window. At the edge of the road stood the woman, her body now fully facing us, those backward bending legs clearly visible beneath her tunic. She raised a hand in what almost seemed like a wave. The paramedic, an older man with a weathered face, explained they'd been called by the workers who'd left earlier. They knew you stayed behind, he said, and they knew what would happen. Back in the village, as a local doctor checked us for injuries, one of the elders explained what we'd encountered. The forest, he said, was home to the restless dead, people who had come to the mountains seeking something and never returned. Their bodies wandered at night, animated by something ancient and malevolent that lived deep within the mountain. The circle you found, the elder said gravely, is where they gather, where they feed it. We left as soon as the doctor cleared us, driving through the night back to Mexico City. I quit my job the next day. Andres did too. We don't talk about what happened, not really, except once when he drunkenly admitted he still sees her sometimes, standing at the foot of his bed. As for me, I've moved to an apartment in the heart of the city, surrounded by noise and people and light. But it doesn't help, because just before we escaped in that paramedic truck, as she stood at the edge of the forest, I heard her voice in my head as clearly as if she'd whispered in my ear, I'll see you in your dreams. And she does. Every night. I still can't fully comprehend what happened that summer at my grandfather's cabin. It's been nearly 8 years now, but I'm writing this down because I need to tell someone, and I can't exactly bring this up at family dinners anymore. They all think I had some kind of traumatic breakdown that night, but what I saw was real. I know it was. My grandfather owned this old cabin by Lake Moraine in northern Michigan. It was pretty secluded, about a 40-minute drive from the nearest town, with no neighbors for miles. Every summer when school let out, all the cousins would spend 2 weeks there fishing, swimming, and exploring the woods. It was like our annual family tradition. The cabin itself was rustic as hell. No electricity except for a small generator we'd run for a few hours each evening, no cell service, and definitely no indoor plumbing. That meant using the outhouse, which was probably 30 yards into the woods behind the cabin. The path to it was marked with stones my grandfather had placed years ago, but after dark, it was a journey none of us kids wanted to make. That particular summer, I was 12. My parents had just gone through a nasty divorce, so my mom was extra eager to ship me off to Grandpa's for a bit longer than usual. 3 whole weeks instead of 2. She thought the fresh air would do me good, or whatever parents say when they need space. The day it happened started like any other at the cabin. We'd spent most of it swimming and having diving contests off the small dock. My older cousin Ben had brought these old walkie-talkies, and we were using them to coordinate this elaborate game of hide-and-seek in the woods near the cabin, but never past the tree line where Grandpa had strung up this faded red rope. He was always super strict about us not going beyond that point. After dinner, we did our usual routine around the fire pit. Grandpa would let us roast marshmallows while he told these wild stories about his time as a forest ranger. That night, Ben decided we should tell ghost stories after Grandpa went to bed. He went first with some stupid story about a hook-handed killer, but my cousin Emma actually told a genuinely creepy one about creatures that lived in the woods and ate lost travelers. "They only come out at night," she'd said in this exaggerated whisper. "They can smell your fear, and they're so pale they practically glow in the dark. And their mouths—" She'd stretched her fingers wide around her face. "They unhinge like snakes to swallow you whole." We all laughed it off, but I remember feeling uneasy. When we finally decided to head in around 11 p.m., I realized I needed to use the bathroom. Badly. I'd been putting it off because I hated that outhouse, especially at night. I grabbed the flashlight we kept by the door, but when I clicked it on, it flickered weakly before dying completely. Typical. The batteries were always going dead. "Grandpa," I called out, "the flashlight's dead." He was already snoring on his cot in the corner of the main room. My cousins had claimed the only bedroom, and I was supposed to sleep on the pull-out couch. "Just use the moonlight," Ben mumbled from the bedroom. "It's bright enough tonight. Don't be such a baby, Jackson." I wasn't about to wake my grandfather, and I really had to go. So I stepped outside onto the porch, looking up at the full moon. It was bright, casting everything in this silvery blue light that made familiar shapes look alien. The path to the outhouse was visible enough, I figured. Just follow the stones. The night air was cool against my skin as I made my way carefully down the path. Every twig snap under my feet made me jump a little. I kept thinking about Emma's stupid story, imagining pale creatures watching me from between the trees. I was about halfway to the outhouse when I heard it, a strange rustling sound off to my left. Probably just a raccoon, I thought. But then there was another noise, something between a click and a whistle that definitely wasn't a raccoon. I stopped walking, my heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. Nothing answered, but the forest had gone completely silent. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking from the lake's edge, just heavy, waiting silence. I picked up my pace, eyes locked on the stone path, but then I heard it again, closer this time, and instinctively turned to look. There was nothing there, just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on my eyes. But in that moment of distraction, I missed a curve in the path. When I looked down again, the stones were gone. No big deal, I thought. I just needed to backtrack a few steps and find where I'd strayed off the path. I turned around, scanning the ground, but couldn't see the stones anywhere. Panic started to rise in my chest. How far had I walked while looking for whatever made that noise? I stood still, trying to orient myself. The cabin had to be back in that direction, where I could see a small clearing through the trees. I started walking that way, certain I'd hit the path again, or at least see the cabin lights. But after a few minutes, I didn't recognize anything. The clearing I'd seen wasn't the right one. The trees were denser here, taller. I was getting deeper into the woods, not closer to the cabin. "Ben!" I shouted, hoping the sound would carry back to the cabin. "Emma! Grandpa!" My only answer was the faint echo of my own voice bouncing back at me. I tried to calm down and think logically. The lake had to be south of where I was. If I could find the lake, I could follow the shoreline back to the cabin. But which way was south? Without the moon visible through the thick canopy above me, I had no reference point. I was completely lost. I don't know how long I wandered, trying to find my way back. It could have been 30 minutes or 3 hours. Time seemed to stretch and compress randomly. My bladder had long since given up on holding it, and I was wet, cold, and terrified. Eventually, I came to another small clearing and decided I needed help. Grandpa had taught us basic survival skills, including how to build a signal fire. Maybe if I could get one going, they'd see the smoke or the light and find me. I gathered what dry sticks and leaves I could find, piling them in the center of the clearing. Using 2 rocks, I tried to create sparks the way Grandpa had shown us. It took forever, my hands shaking from cold and fear, but finally, a small ember caught in the dry leaves. I blew on it gently, watching it grow into a tiny flame. The light from the fire barely illuminated the clearing, but it was something. I added more sticks carefully, building it up until it cast a warm orange glow around me. For the first time in hours, I felt a flicker of hope. That's when I heard the voices. At first I thought it was my cousins looking for me. I almost called out, but something held me back. The voices didn't sound right. They were high-pitched and strangely musical, with a cadence that didn't match any language I'd ever heard. It was like listening to birds communicate, except with words that almost made sense. Against my better judgment, I extinguished my small fire and moved toward the sound. If it wasn't my family, maybe it was campers who could help me. The moonlight broke through the trees again as I approached what seemed to be another, larger clearing. I crouched behind a fallen log at the edge of this clearing, peering over to see who was talking. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. There were 3 of them. At first glance, they looked almost human. They stood on 2 legs and had arms and what I guess you'd call faces. But that's where the similarities ended. They were tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. Their skin was a sickly grayish white that seemed to reflect the moonlight, making them look like they were glowing from within. But it was their faces that made my blood freeze. Where eyes should have been, there were just dark, empty sockets, not like they'd been gouged out, but like they'd never had eyes to begin with. And their mouths. God, their mouths were all wrong. They stretched across nearly the entire width of their faces, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed wet in the moonlight. They were hunched over something on the ground. With horror, I realized it was a deer, or what was left of one. They were tearing into it with those terrible mouths, making wet smacking sounds as they fed. One of them would make that clicking, whistling noise I'd heard earlier, and the others would respond with similar sounds. I must have made some noise, a gasp or whimper, because suddenly all 3 of them stopped feeding. They turned in perfect unison toward my hiding place, their eyeless faces somehow staring directly at me. I screamed. I couldn't help it. Terror ripped the sound from my throat before I could stop it. In an instant they were moving toward me. They didn't run exactly. It was more like they flowed across the ground, their two long limbs bending in impossible ways as they closed the distance between us. I turned and ran blindly through the woods, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear them behind me, making those awful clicking sounds that were somehow more terrifying than any growl or roar could have been. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. Then my foot caught on a root and I went down hard. The air knocked from my lungs. I rolled onto my back, certain I was about to die. One of the creatures loomed over me, its massive mouth stretching into what might have been a smile. It reached for me with long, bony fingers, and I closed my eyes, too terrified to even scream. The gunshot was so loud it felt like my eardrums had burst. My eyes flew open in time to see the creature jerking backward, a dark hole where its chest should have been. It made a high, keening sound that hurt my ears. "Get away from him!" It was my grandfather's voice. He stood a few yards away, his old shotgun raised, already aiming for a second shot. The other two creatures made those clicking sounds again, but faster now, more urgent. They retreated, moving with that same unnatural fluidity, and grabbed their fallen companion by its limbs. As they dragged it back into the deeper woods, I heard the sickening sounds of cracking bones and wet tearing. They were eating it, their own kind. The realization made me vomit. Grandpa was at my side then, helping me to my feet. He didn't speak, just put his arm around me and half carried me through the woods. Somehow, he knew exactly which way to go. Within 20 minutes, we were back at the cabin. My cousins were awake, pale and frightened. They'd heard my screams and the gunshot, but Grandpa had told them to stay inside no matter what. Once inside, Grandpa checked me for injuries, then made me drink something hot and bitter that he said would help me sleep. Before the drink pulled me under, I managed to ask him what those things were. He sat heavily in his old chair, suddenly looking much older than his 70 years. "They've been here longer than us," was all he said. "They don't bother people as long as—" He trailed off, looking out the window into the darkness. "As long as what?" I whispered. "As long as they're fed," he finished, his voice flat. I wanted to ask more questions, but whatever he'd given me was pulling me down into darkness. The last thing I remember from that night was hearing him load shells into his shotgun, the click-clack sound somehow reassuring as I drifted off. The next morning, Grandpa acted like nothing had happened. When I tried to talk about it, he cut me off. "Some things are better left alone, Jackson," he said firmly. "Just stay on the marked paths." That afternoon, I watched from the porch as he installed solar-powered lamps along the entire path to the outhouse. He spaced them precisely, ensuring there wasn't a single section of the path that remained in darkness. We never spoke of that night again. My cousins thought I'd gotten lost in the woods, and Grandpa had fired his gun to scare off a bear or wolf. Maybe that would have been easier to believe. After Grandpa died 3 years later, I was the only one who wanted to keep visiting the cabin. I go every summer now, and I always maintain those solar lights along the path. I've never seen those creatures again, but sometimes at night I hear those clicking, whistling sounds from the deep woods. Grandpa left me a freezer in the shed behind the cabin. In his will, he instructed me to keep it stocked with meat, deer mostly, which I buy from hunters in town. Once a month, I leave the meat at the edge of the clearing where I first saw them. It's always gone by morning. I don't know what they are or how many of them exist in those woods. I don't know how Grandpa first encountered them or what kind of arrangement he made. All I know is that they're still out there, and the path to the outhouse is still marked with lights that I replace religiously every season. Stay on the marked paths. That's the rule at Lake Moraine, the only rule that matters. I've been trying to make sense of what happened to me last November for months now. I still wake up in cold sweats, thinking I hear that word, that goddamn word, being whispered from the dark corners of my bedroom. I've never been a superstitious guy, but after what happened in those Michigan woods, I don't know what to believe anymore. I moved to Cooper County about 8 months before everything went to hell. It's this tiny, remote area in Upper Michigan, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the nearest Walmart is an hour's drive. I'd taken a job with the Department of Natural Resources after my divorce, wanting to get away from everything and everyone. The peninsula is beautiful, dense forests, pristine lakes, and more wildlife than people. Perfect for someone like me who needed space to rebuild. Thanksgiving was approaching, and for the first time in 15 years, I wouldn't be joining my family for our annual deer hunting trip in Wisconsin. My ex had the kids that weekend, and the thought of being alone during what was typically our big family tradition hit me harder than I expected. So I decided I'd carry on the tradition solo in my new home. I asked around town about good hunting spots. The locals at Marge's Diner pointed me toward a public hunting area about 20 miles from my cabin. Just follow Forest Service Road 27 until it ends. Roy, the old-timer who ran the local hardware store, told me, best spot for bucks in the whole county. Just don't go wandering too far north. Easy to get turned around up there. The day before Thanksgiving, I packed my Remington 30-06, enough food for the day, extra clothes, my hunting knife, and other essentials into my Jeep. I'd planned to be back before dark, just a simple day hunt to keep the tradition alive. I remember checking the weather report before I left. Cloudy with a 30% chance of snow. Nothing to worry about in Michigan. I headed out at 4:30 a.m., the darkness still absolute as I drove deeper into the forest. The road got rougher the further I went, my headlights cutting through a tunnel of pine trees that seemed to close in behind me. I reached the end of the service road around 5:15, just a small clearing with space for maybe 3 vehicles to park. Nobody else was there. From the parking area, I hiked about 2 miles in, guided by my headlamp. The forest was dead quiet that morning. No birds, no rustling, just the crunch of my boots on the frosty ground and the sound of my breathing. I found a good spot on a ridge overlooking a natural clearing and set up my hunting blind. As the sun rose, the forest came to life, but not how I expected. No deer, no squirrels, not even birds. Just this eerie low wind that made the trees creak like they were whispering to each other. I sat there for hours, sipping coffee from my thermos, waiting. Nothing. By 3 p.m., my ass was numb from sitting, and I was getting antsy. The sky had darkened considerably, that steely gray that promises snow, and I figured I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. Rather than waste the day entirely, I decided to do a bit of stalking, maybe find some fresh tracks to follow. I left my blind and started moving through the woods, going north without thinking much about it. The terrain gradually became more rugged, with rock outcroppings breaking through the forest floor. After about 40 minutes of hiking, I crested a small hill and spotted something that stopped me in my tracks, a cabin. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied, just a small, rough-hewn log structure with a metal chimney pipe poking through the roof, thin wisps of smoke rising from it. My first thought was other hunters, which was a relief. Maybe they'd seen some game, knew the area better. As I approached, the first few snowflakes began to fall. I noticed there were no vehicles nearby, no ATV tracks, nothing to indicate how someone had gotten to this remote spot. The cabin looked old but maintained, not some abandoned relic. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Nothing. I tested the door handle, and it swung open easily. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone here?" The inside was simple but cozy. A wood stove against one wall still burning low and warm, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some canned goods, and a narrow cot in the corner. No electricity, no plumbing that I could see. Just a basic hunter's refuge. I was about to leave when I heard the wind pick up outside. Looking through the small window, I saw the snow was coming down hard now, way harder than the forecast had predicted. In the few minutes I'd been inside, the ground was already turning white, and visibility was dropping fast. "Shit," I muttered. I was at least 4 or 5 miles from my Jeep in unfamiliar territory, with a snowstorm rolling in. I decided to wait it out in the cabin, figuring whoever owned it would understand given the circumstances. I'd leave some money to compensate for using their shelter. On the table sat a clay jug with no label. I unscrewed the cap and sniffed. Definitely wine, homemade by the smell of it. Probably blackberry or some other wild fruit. Given the cold and my growing anxiety about the weather, I figured a small drink might calm my nerves. I poured some into a tin cup I found hanging by the stove and left $40 on the table, more than generous for the inconvenience. The wine tasted strange. Not bad, but unlike any I'd had before. Sweet, but with an earthy, almost mineral aftertaste. By the time I'd finished the cup, my entire body felt warm, and my head was swimming. Not normal for just one drink, even on an empty stomach. I remember thinking I should eat something, but my limbs felt impossibly heavy. The last thing I recall before losing consciousness was watching the snow through the window, thinking it looked like static on an old TV. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke, the cabin was pitch black and freezing cold. The fire had died completely. My head pounded, and my mouth tasted like I'd been licking a copper penny. Outside, the wind howled, but I couldn't see anything through the window, just darkness and swirling snow. I fumbled for my phone to check the time. 11:42 p.m. I'd been unconscious for hours. Disoriented and cold, I decided to get the fire going again. I knelt by the wood stove, feeling around for matches I remembered seeing on the shelf beside it. As I groped in the darkness, a match suddenly flared to life in front of my face. I jerked back, nearly falling on my ass. There, illuminated in the small circle of light, was a face, an old man's face, deeply wrinkled with a wild gray beard. But where his eyes should have been were just empty sockets. Not bloody or scarred, just smooth depressions in his face, like he'd been born without eyes. I scrambled backward, knocking over the chair behind me. The match went out. Darkness again. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. Another match struck, closer now. The eyeless old man stood directly in front of me. His mouth moved, but the words that came out sounded wrong, like his voice was coming from everywhere at once. "You drank," he said, not angry, just stating a fact. "Now you see." I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed my rifle from where I'd propped it by the door and fled into the storm. The snow was blinding, at least 6 inches deep already, but I ran anyway. Behind me I heard the old man's voice calling out something that sounded like "peacock" over and over. I had no idea which direction I was going. The forest looked completely different under snow, and without the sun or stars for reference, I was just running blindly. My boots kept sinking into hidden dips and branches whipped at my face. After what felt like an hour, my lungs burning from the cold air, I stopped to catch my breath against a large tree. The wind had died down somewhat, and in that moment of relative quiet, I heard it. Something moving through the snow behind me. Not the crunch of footsteps, but a dragging sound, like someone pulling a heavy sack. I started running again. The terrain began to slope upward, becoming rockier. Ahead, barely visible in the darkness, I saw what looked like a small opening in the rock face, a cave or crevice. Without thinking, I headed toward it. Anything to get out of the open, away from whatever was following me. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, it opened up a bit, but I couldn't see anything. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, but it was dead, probably from the cold. As I shoved it back in my pocket, my fingers brushed against something I didn't recognize. I pulled it out, a small box of wooden matches. I definitely hadn't brought these with me. My hand shook as I struck one. The small flame revealed I was in some kind of natural cave, maybe 10 feet across with a low ceiling. The match burned down to my fingers, and I dropped it, plunging back into darkness. That's when I heard it, a wet, slithering sound coming from deeper in the cave. Something moving, something breathing. I struck another match, holding it out in front of me. The flame illuminated something that my brain still refuses to fully process. About 15 feet away, a thing was dragging itself toward me using its arms. Its lower body seemed useless, just dragging behind like dead weight. But that wasn't the worst part. Its pale, naked body was covered with dark holes, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. And in each hole was an eye, a real, blinking human eye. They weren't all the same. Some brown, some blue, some green, some bloodshot, all of them focusing on me at once. I dropped the match in shock, but not before I saw its face, or where a face should be. Just more eyes, arranged in no particular pattern, and a mouth that was too wide, filled with small, sharp teeth. In the darkness, I heard it moving faster. I struck another match and saw it was only feet away now, its long, thin fingers reaching toward my face, toward my eyes. I screamed and lashed out with the burning match. The creature recoiled when the flame touched it, making a sound like steam escaping a kettle. I used the moment to scramble further into the cave, away from the entrance. Looking back, I realize how insane that decision was, going deeper rather than trying to get out. But I was beyond rational thought at that point. The cave narrowed into a tunnel, forcing me to crawl. Behind me, I could hear the creature following, that horrible wet sound of its body dragging across stone. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber. I struck another match and nearly vomited. The walls were covered with more of those things, clinging to the rock like bizarre insects, their eye-covered bodies glistening in the matchlight. As one, they all turned toward me, hundreds of eyes blinking in unison. I ran through the chamber into another tunnel, moving purely on adrenaline and terror. My rifle was long gone, lost somewhere in my panic. I still had my hunting knife, but what good would that do against whatever these things were? I don't know how long I ran through that cave system. The tunnels twisted and branched, sometimes forcing me to crawl, sometimes opening into chambers large enough to stand in. I rationed my matches, striking one only when I reached a junction and needed to choose a path. During one of these brief moments of light, I used my phone to record what was happening. The battery was nearly dead, but I needed to document this, needed to leave some record of what I'd found. I spoke quickly, describing everything I'd seen, everything that had happened since I entered that cabin. As I spoke into my phone, I remembered what the old man had said. "You drank, now you see." and that word he kept repeating, peacock. It hit me then, in that moment of clarity that sometimes comes when you're beyond exhaustion. Peacocks, eye-covered feathers. These creatures, with their bodies covered in eyes, they were peacocks in some twisted sense. I wondered if I was being punished, if this was some kind of supernatural judgment for all the hunting I'd done over the years, for all the lives I'd taken without really considering them lives at all. My phone died as I was recording, and darkness enveloped me again. I had maybe 5 matches left. My knife was in my hand, though I didn't remember drawing it. Behind me I could still hear them coming, that wet dragging sound echoing through the tunnels. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know what's out there in the Cooper County wilderness, what's hiding in those caves, what happens when you drink from an unmarked jug in a cabin that shouldn't exist. I don't know if I'll ever find my way out of these tunnels. The matches are almost gone, but they're still behind me. I can hear them getting closer, and whenever I strike a match, I see more eyes watching from the darkness ahead. If anyone finds this, stay away from the northern woods of Cooper County. And if you ever come across a cabin in the woods with smoke coming from the chimney, keep walking. Whatever you do, don't drink the wine. I have to keep moving now. 1 match left. The dragging sounds are getting closer, and I swear, just moments ago, I heard that old man's voice echoing through the tunnels. Peacock, he whispered. Peacock. I've never told this story in full before. It's been 22 years since it happened, and I still get nightmares sometimes. I'm only sharing this now because I need to know if anyone else has experienced anything similar. Back in 2001, I was a sophomore in college. Me, my best friend John, my girlfriend Lauren, and John's new girlfriend Lisa decided to take a weekend camping trip to get away from campus. John had been dating Lisa for about a month at that point. She seemed nice, kind of quiet and serious, a biology major who was really into nature. John was a party guy, so their relationship surprised us all, but whatever. He was my best friend since high school, and I was just happy he was happy. We picked Crab Key, some locals called it Osprey Island, for our trip. It's a small, uninhabited island, about an hour by boat off the southeastern coast. John's uncle had a small motorboat we could borrow, and John knew the area well enough to navigate there. The island wasn't huge, maybe a mile long and half a mile wide, but it was densely wooded with pine and oak trees. There was an old Native American shell mound in the center, basically a huge pile of ancient oyster shells that formed a small hill. It seemed like the perfect spot to camp. We packed enough supplies for 2 nights: tents, sleeping bags, coolers with beer and food, fishing gear, and a couple lanterns. The boat ride out there was awesome. It was early October, sunny and cool, and we were all excited about getting away from campus for a while. We arrived around noon on Saturday and spent the afternoon setting up camp on top of the shell mound. Seemed like the driest spot. Swimming at the little beach and fishing. Everything was completely normal and chill. We caught some fish for dinner, built a fire, and sat around drinking beers as the sun went down. It was starting to get dark when Lauren realized she'd left her inhaler in the boat. She has mild asthma, and while she wasn't having any issues, she didn't want to be without it overnight. I offered to walk back to the boat with her. The walk from our campsite to where we'd beached the boat was maybe a 1/4 mile through the woods. It was twilight when we headed out, but by the time we got to the boat and found her inhaler, it was getting pretty dark. We had 1 flashlight between us for the walk back. About halfway back to camp, Lauren stopped suddenly and whispered, "Do you smell that?" At first, I didn't smell anything except the normal forest smells. Then it hit me, this incredibly foul body odor smell. Not like someone who needed a shower, but like decay or something rotting mixed with the worst BO you can imagine. It made my eyes water. Jesus, I muttered, covering my nose with my shirt. What the hell is that? Right after I said that, we heard rustling in the bushes about 20 feet to our right. Not like a small animal. This was something big moving through the underbrush. Lauren grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. We froze, listening. The rustling stopped, then started again, moving away from us. "Let's get back to camp," I whispered, and we hurried down the path, practically jogging. When we got back to the shell mound, we found John frantically searching around the campsite with a flashlight. "Have you guys seen Lisa?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "No," I said. "Isn't she here?" "We just went to get Lauren's inhaler. She went to pee in the woods like 15 minutes ago and hasn't come back," John said. "I've been calling for her." We started calling Lisa's name, sweeping the area around the campsite with our flashlights. After about 10 minutes of this, Lauren spotted her. "There!" Lauren pointed her flashlight at a spot about 30 yards into the trees. Lisa was just standing there, completely motionless, facing away from us, staring off into the dark woods. "Lisa!" John called, rushing toward her. "We've been looking everywhere for you." When he reached her, he put his hand on her shoulder. She slowly turned around, and even from where I was standing, I could tell something was wrong. Her eyes looked unfocused, and she didn't respond to John at first. "Are you okay?" John asked, clearly concerned. Finally, she blinked a few times and said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I just got a little lost." As they walked back toward us, I noticed Lisa had wet herself. There was a dark stain down the front of her jeans. Nobody mentioned it. I figured she was embarrassed enough, having gotten lost and probably scared out in the woods alone. We all went back to the campfire, and John gave Lisa a pair of his sweatpants to change into. She went into their tent to change, and when she came back out, she seemed more like herself. She drank a beer and even laughed at some of John's jokes, though I noticed she was quieter than usual. Around midnight, we all turned in. Lauren and I were in one tent, John and Lisa in the other. I was pretty tired and fell asleep quickly. I woke up around 7:30 the next morning. Lauren was still asleep beside me. I unzipped the tent quietly and stepped out. The morning was cool and foggy. John was already up, building a small fire to make coffee. "Morning," I said, stretching. "Lisa still asleep?" John looked up, his expression worried. "I thought she was with you guys." My stomach dropped. "What? No, she was with you." "I woke up and she wasn't in the tent," John said. "I figured she got up early and was sitting with you guys or something." We checked around the campsite, calling her name. Nothing. Lauren woke up from all the commotion and joined the search. We spread out a bit, still keeping the campsite in sight. After about 20 minutes with no sign of her, John was starting to panic. "We need to search the whole island," he said. "She wouldn't just wander off." Lauren volunteered to stay at the campsite in case Lisa came back while John and I searched. We agreed to stay within shouting distance of each other as we moved through the woods. We searched for about an hour, calling Lisa's name constantly. The island wasn't that big, so we covered a lot of ground. On the far side, away from where we'd beached the boat, I found something disturbing. There was a patch of underbrush that was crushed down, like something heavy had been lying there. What made my skin crawl was the blood. Not a huge amount, but definitely blood, dark and already dried, spattered on some of the leaves and ground. "John," I called, "over here." He crashed through the underbrush toward me. When he saw the blood, his face went white. Do you think? He couldn't finish the sentence. I knelt down to look closer. I don't think it's human blood, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Probably some animal. Maybe a deer or something got attacked by a coyote. I had no idea if there were even coyotes on the island, but I needed to say something reassuring. We searched the area but found no animal remains or any other signs of what might have happened. With nothing else to go on, we reluctantly headed back to camp. As we approached the shell mound, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. Lisa was sitting by the fire pit with Lauren, drinking coffee like nothing had happened. "Lisa," John rushed over to her. "Where the hell have you been? We've been searching the entire island for you." She looked confused. "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time." "No, you haven't," John said. "I woke up and you were gone." "I just went for a short walk this morning," Lisa said calmly. "I've been back here for at least an hour." Lauren gave me a strange look over Lisa's shoulder. I knew what she was thinking. That wasn't true. Lisa hadn't been at the campsite when we left to search. "Lisa," Lauren said carefully, "you weren't here when we all woke up. We were worried about you." "You must be confused," Lisa said, her voice flat. "I went for a walk at sunrise and came right back. I've been sitting here talking with Lauren for ages." Lauren's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't contradict Lisa. The whole situation felt wrong, but we didn't know what to say. Maybe Lisa was embarrassed about wandering off twice and was trying to save face. But the way she denied it so confidently was unsettling. We ate breakfast in uncomfortable silence. Lisa seemed completely normal otherwise, talking about classes, asking what we wanted to do that day. We decided to go fishing again and spend the day on the beach. I kept a close eye on Lisa, but she gave no indication that anything was wrong. Around 4 p.m., we headed back to camp to start dinner. John suggested we pack up early in the morning and head back to the mainland. Nobody objected. John and I went to check on the boat before it got dark. When we reached the shore, I stopped dead in my tracks. The boat was still there, beached where we'd left it, but the motor had been destroyed. Not just damaged, destroyed. Someone or something had smashed it repeatedly. The propeller was bent at an impossible angle, and all the wiring had been ripped out. "What the fuck?" John whispered, examining the damage. "This wasn't an accident." We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing, but not wanting to say it. There was nobody else on this island, at least nobody we'd seen. "Maybe it was animals?" I suggested lamely. John gave me a look. "Animals that know how to target a boat motor and rip out specific wiring?" We decided not to panic the girls immediately. The boat was still structurally sound. We'd just lost the motor. We could potentially paddle back to the mainland, though it would be exhausting and take hours. We agreed we'd leave at first light. When we got back to camp, Lisa wasn't there again. Lauren was alone, looking worried. "She said she needed to use the bathroom," Lauren explained. "That was like 20 minutes ago." Not again. We immediately started searching, and this time we found her within 10 minutes. She was at the edge of the clearing, just standing there, staring into the woods again. "Lisa," John approached her cautiously, "what are you doing?" When she turned around, I noticed a smear of something dark on her chin and the front of her shirt. It looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Just getting some air," she said. Her voice sounded different, deeper, almost hoarse. John took her hand and led her back to camp. I whispered to Lauren about the boat while they were ahead of us. Her face paled, but she nodded and agreed we should leave in the morning. That night was tense. We made a bigger fire than necessary, all of us feeling the need for more light. Lisa barely ate anything at dinner. She kept staring off into the darkness beyond our campfire. Several times I caught her sniffing the air like a dog. We all went to bed around 10 p.m. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to Lauren's breathing beside me and the night sounds of the island. Around midnight, I heard the zipper of the other tent. I tensed, listening. Someone was moving around outside. I carefully unzipped our tent just enough to peek out. Lisa was standing by the dying embers of the fire, completely naked. Before I could decide what to do, she walked off into the darkness of the woods. I quickly put on my shoes and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't want to wake Lauren and scare her, so I slipped out quietly. I hesitated outside John's tent, wondering if I should wake him, but decided to check on Lisa first. I followed in the direction she'd gone, moving as quietly as possible. The woods were pitch black beyond the beam of my flashlight. After walking about 50 yards, I found her clothes in a pile on the ground. They were soaked with what looked like blood. My heart was hammering in my chest. I swept the flashlight around but saw no sign of Lisa. Then I heard it, that same rustling sound from the night before, but faster now, like something moving quickly through the underbrush. And that smell, that horrible rotting body odor smell, was back, stronger than ever. I ran back to camp, no longer caring about being quiet. I burst into John's tent, shaking him awake. "John, Lisa's gone again, and there's blood on her clothes." He was instantly alert. We woke Lauren and I quickly explained what I'd seen. We gathered everything we could carry quickly, a flashlight, the lantern, water bottles, and John's pocket knife, and headed straight for the boat. Whatever was happening, we needed to get off this island. We were about halfway to the shore when we heard it, a strange guttural sound from the darkness to our right. Not quite human, not quite animal. Lauren grabbed my arm. "What was that?" "Keep moving," John whispered urgently. The sound came again, closer this time. We started running. We broke through the trees onto the beach and rushed to the boat. As John and I started pushing it toward the water, Lauren screamed. I spun around and saw something at the edge of the trees. In the beam of the flashlight, I caught a glimpse of a figure. It was moving on all fours like an animal, but it was wrong. It looked human-sized, naked and pale, but moving in a way humans don't move, with jerky, unnatural motions. "Get in the boat!" John yelled. Lauren scrambled in while we pushed harder. The thing at the edge of the woods let out another of those horrible sounds, a mix between a growl and a scream, and charged toward us. As it got closer, I caught a better look at it. It had Lisa's face, or something like Lisa's face, but twisted, the mouth too wide, the eyes reflective like an animal's in the flashlight beam. It was her, but not her. It reached us just as we got the boat into water deep enough that we were wading. It went straight for the flashlight Lauren was holding, grabbing it from her hand and smashing it violently against the ground until it broke, plunging us into darkness except for the dim lantern in the boat. In that moment of chaos, John and I gave one final push and jumped into the boat. We had no motor, but we had a paddle and the current was carrying us away from shore. The Lisa thing stayed at the water's edge, pacing back and forth. It picked up our lantern from where we'd set it on the sand and began smashing it just like the flashlight, seeming enraged by the light. Then it let out a howl that made the hair on my neck stand up, a sound no human throat could make. We paddled frantically until we were well away from the shore. Eventually, we were too far to see anything but the dark shape of the island. We drifted all night, taking turns paddling to keep us moving toward the mainland. Around dawn, we were spotted by a fishing boat that towed us back to shore. We told them we'd had engine trouble. None of us ever reported what really happened. Who would believe us? We just said Lisa had decided to stay at college while we went camping. and she was fine when we got back. But she wasn't. The Lisa that returned to campus the next week looked like Lisa, talked like Lisa, but something was different. Her eyes seemed empty. She broke up with John immediately. He was devastated at first, but then started avoiding her completely, saying things didn't feel right when she was around. My relationship with Lauren fell apart within a few months. We never talked about what happened on the island, but it was always there between us. The strangest part was what happened to John. About 6 months after our trip, he started acting weird, becoming withdrawn, missing classes, sniffing the air sometimes like Lisa had done. One day he just disappeared, dropped out of school, cut all contact. His parents filed a missing persons report, but I knew they wouldn't find him. I think whatever was on that island got inside Lisa somehow, and later it got John too. Sometimes I catch that faint smell, that distinctive rotting odor, and I wonder if it's found its way to me at last. I've never been camping since. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 8 months now, and I still can't wrap my head around what happened. I need to get this off my chest because it's eating me alive, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar, or can make sense of it all. My best mate Dylan and I decided to go camping in the bush, about an hour west of Dubbo, NS dollars. We're both 18, finished school last year, and wanted one last adventure before Dylan started uni and I began my apprenticeship. We knew the spot was technically off limits, private property that borders national park land, but Dylan's uncle had taken him there years ago, and he swore it was worth the risk. Just pristine bush, a beautiful river, and complete isolation. We packed my old Hilux with our swags, fishing gear, a small gas cooker, and enough food and beer for 5 days. Dylan brought his dad's rifle, just in case, for snakes or wild pigs, he said. I packed a hunting knife my grandfather gave me. Standard stuff for bush camping in Australia, nothing out of the ordinary. The drive took longer than we expected. The last half hour was on dirt roads that got progressively worse until they weren't really roads at all, just tire tracks disappearing into tall grass. We arrived late afternoon on Monday, set up camp about 50 meters from the river, and cracked open a couple of beers to celebrate. The first few days were exactly what we wanted, swimming in the river, catching a few fish, drinking around the campfire, and talking shit until the early hours. The isolation was incredible. No phone reception, no other people, not even planes overhead. Just us, the bush, and the stars. Thursday is when things changed. That night, something woke me around 3 a.m. At first, I thought it was Dylan getting up to take a piss, but when I looked over, he was sound asleep in his swag. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a kangaroo or a wombat. "Dylan," I whispered, reaching across to shake him awake. "There's something out there." He woke up groggy but alert enough to listen. The footsteps continued, methodically circling our camp. Whatever it was big. The footsteps were heavy, pressing into the ground with purpose. "Probably just a roo," Dylan whispered back, but I could tell from his voice he didn't believe it. We lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the footsteps. They never sped up, never slowed down, just a constant, even pace. Circle after circle around our camp. Then it stopped. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. At least with the footsteps, we knew where it was. A screech cut through the night, a sound I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. Not a bird, not a mammal, nothing I could identify. It was high-pitched and guttural at the same time, like something was being tortured. The sound echoed across the river, bouncing back at us from every direction. Dylan and I both sat bolt upright, staring at each other through the darkness. "What the fuck was that?" I hissed. Before he could answer, we heard rapid footsteps, like someone sprinting on all fours, tearing through the underbrush away from our camp. The sound faded into the distance, and then silence returned. Neither of us slept after that. We sat up, back to back, Dylan with the rifle across his lap, me with my knife, watching the tree line until dawn broke. When the sun finally came up, we were exhausted but tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a fox or something," Dylan said, but his eyes kept darting to the trees. "Yeah, maybe," I agreed, not believing it for a second. "Let's make some coffee." We went about our day, fishing in the morning, swimming in the afternoon, trying to pretend everything was normal, but there was a tension between us that hadn't been there before. We both kept looking over our shoulders. Both jumped at every sound from the bush. As evening approached, I started getting our dinner ready. Just some snags on the portable gas cooker. We were running low on firewood for the campfire. "I'll go grab some more wood," Dylan offered, grabbing the small hatchet we'd brought. "You sure?" I asked, feeling uneasy. "I can come with you?" "Nah, it's fine. Just going to grab what's on the ground, not chopping anything. Back in 20. He flashed his usual grin and headed toward the trees. I watched him disappear into the bush, the unease growing in my stomach. I focused on cooking, trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. The sun was getting low, and Dylan still wasn't back. I turned off the cooker, grabbed my knife, and after a moment's hesitation, grabbed the rifle too. Dylan had the hatchet, but something told me I might need more than that. "Dylan," I called as I entered the trees. "Dylan, mate, where are you?" No answer, just the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I followed what looked like a path of broken twigs and disturbed leaves, calling Dylan's name every few minutes. The bush got thicker the further I went, the trees closing in around me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw a figure through the trees. Relief washed over me. "Dylan, Jesus, man, you had me worried." The words died in my throat as I heard a screech behind me, the same tortured sound from the night before, but closer, much closer. I spun around, rifle raised, but saw nothing. When I turned back, the figure was gone. My heart pounding against my ribs, I ran. I didn't care about direction. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping my face and arms. Somehow I found my way back to camp, bursting from the trees with the rifle still clutched in my sweating hands. And there, sitting by the campfire, was Dylan. He looked up as I stumbled into camp, his face breaking into a grin. Holy fuck, man. That was scary as fuck. I stared at him, trying to catch my breath. Where the hell were you?" He shrugged. "Got a bit turned around. Found some good wood, though." He gestured to a small pile next to the fire. Something was off. Dylan was wearing different clothes, a black t-shirt instead of the red one he'd left in. His face was flushed like he'd been running, but he seemed calm, too calm. "Did you hear that?" I asked, still catching my breath. "That screech?" Dylan's expression didn't change. "Nah, didn't hear anything. You all right? Looked like you've seen a ghost." I sat down heavily, the rifle still in my hands. "I thought I saw you in the woods, but then I heard that sound from last night, and when I turned back, you were gone." Dylan laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't his laugh. It was close but wrong somehow, like someone doing an impression of Dylan's laugh. "Probably just spooked yourself, mate. This place gets to your head after a few days." I nodded slowly, not taking my eyes off him. Yeah, maybe. We ate dinner in relative silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Dylan. He ate ravenously, tearing into the sausages like he hadn't eaten in days. His movements were slightly off, too, jerky and deliberate, like he was thinking about each one before doing it. After dinner, I said I needed to go to the river to wash up. In reality, I needed to clear my head, to convince myself I was being paranoid. The river was peaceful in the moonlight, the water reflecting the stars above. I washed our plates, trying to rationalize Dylan's behavior. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the isolation was getting to both of us. That's when I saw it, caught on a branch hanging low over the water. A torn red t-shirt. Dylan's shirt. The one he'd been wearing when he left camp. With shaking hands, I pulled it from the branch. It was soaked through, not just with river water, but with something dark and viscous. Blood. My stomach lurched. I dropped the shirt and backed away, then forced myself to pick it up again. I couldn't leave it there. I stuffed it inside my jacket and hurried back to camp. Dylan was sitting exactly where I'd left him, staring into the fire. When I approached, he looked up at me with a blank expression before quickly arranging his face into a smile. "All good?" he asked, his voice just slightly off-pitch. "Yeah," I lied, sitting down across from him. "All good." I watched him carefully over the fire. Every time I shifted position, he would mimic me a few seconds later. When I rubbed my face, he'd do the same. When I took a sip of beer, so would he. It was like watching someone learning how to be human by copying. Remember that time in year 8 when we stole Mr. Patterson's toupee and put it on the school statue? I asked suddenly. Dylan's face went blank for a split second before he smiled. Yeah, good times. My blood ran cold. That had never happened. It was a test, and he'd failed. "What about your 10th birthday? The go-kart track?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, that was sick." Another failure. Dylan had broken his arm the day before his 10th birthday. We'd spent it in the hospital, playing cards on his bed tray. "Do you remember what that thing was last night?" I asked carefully. "The thing making those sounds?" Dylan's smile changed, spreading too wide across his face. "Could have been a skinwalker or something like that. You know, those things from the stories." Dylan had never been interested in supernatural stuff. He was a science guy, always looking for logical explanations. He wouldn't know what a skinwalker was, let alone suggest it so casually. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my face neutral. Yeah, maybe. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my swag, knife clutched in my hand, watching Dylan across the dying embers of the fire. He didn't move all night, didn't shift, didn't roll over, didn't even seem to breathe. He just lay there, eyes closed, perfectly still until dawn. The next morning, I made some excuse about needing to get back for a family thing. Dylan, or whatever was wearing Dylan's face, agreed too readily. We packed up in silence, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. The drive back was excruciating. He sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, occasionally mimicking my movements like he'd done the night before. When I adjusted the rear-view mirror, his hand would twitch like he wanted to do the same. When I checked my blind spot, his head would turn a few seconds later, even though he had nothing to look at. When I dropped him at his house, he got out without grabbing his bag. "Your stuff," I called after him. He turned, that too wide smile spreading across his face again. "I'll get it later. We should go camping again soon. Same spot." I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure." That was 8 months ago. Since then I've seen him, or it, a few times around town. Each time, it's gotten worse. His movements are more fluid now, More natural, but still not quite right. He only eats raw meat. I saw him at a barbecue, eating raw mince straight from the package when he thought no one was looking. He shows up with unexplained bruises and cuts that he can't or won't explain. The real Dylan was a good guy, kind, funny, always there when you needed him. This thing that looks like him is cold, distant, and sometimes outright malicious. Last month, I heard he killed his neighbor's dog, just strangled it with his bare hands because it was barking too much. The old Dylan loved that dog. He keeps inviting me camping, texts me at least once a week. Let's go back to that spot. I found something cool near the river. Don't you want to see what's in the woods? I've blocked his number, avoided places I know he'll be, and told our mutual friends I don't want to be around him. Most of them think we had a falling out, and in a way, I guess we did. I don't know what happened to my best mate in the bush that day. I don't know what's walking around in his body now, but I know it's not him, and I know I'm never going anywhere near those woods again. And if you're camping in remote Australia and hear something circling your camp at night, pack up and leave, immediately, before it takes someone you love.